to the Scottish Affairs Committee, and this morning we're delighted to be joined by former First Minister Alex Salmond in our inquiry into 25 years of devolution. Alec, of course, was the First Minister between 2007 and 2014. If you don't mind introducing yourself, Alec, and anything by way of a short introductory statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm delighted to be here. I was checking the record and I gave evidence to this committee in 2010, almost exactly 10 years ago. And you, Mr. Chairman, are the only surviving member. So you must be in for some sort of award for longevity and long service on this committee. I've looked at I welcome, obviously, your study and report, and I'm delighted to give evidence. I think I'll argue, and obviously respond to your questions, but I'll argue that, in my experience, there have been kind of three phases of intra-governmental cooperation. The first phase is what I found when I was elected in 2007 to be First Minister, and that was that the structures of devolution had totally broken down. There hadn't been a plenary Joint Ministerial Council for 5 years, between 2002 and 2007. I should say that the European one was still working. In fact, Jack Straw was Foreign Secretary, and he told me once that he assumed, because that was working, he assumed all the other ones were working as well. he just made that assumption, but actually it was only the European ones that was working because they were set by European Council meetings and discussions between ministers. And so I knew this beforehand, because in preparation for government, anticipation of hoping for victory. And I actually put it in the manifesto. The 2007 SNP manifesto had a commitment to re-establish, if possible, because obviously it takes agreement, the formal mechanisms of the joint ministerial committees. And that's what I sought to do. Now, I didn't manage that with I think it was 6-7 weeks when I coexisted with Prime Minister Blair, mainly because he didn't speak to me at all. I didn't have a single conversation with him over that period of time. And I actually believe, and I'll substantiate this in answer to questions, that the key reason for the breakdown of the intra-governmental committees was the attitude of the then Prime Minister. I think he was totally disinterested in the mechanics of devolution. He had other things that perhaps he felt were more important. So I would place the responsibility squarely on him. And the evidence for that is when Gordon Brown came in, it was totally different. For example, I spoke to Gordon on his first day in office as he spoke to me on my first day in office. And the JMC plenary was re-established, and other meetings they were established. We tried to get a better format for them. And it was pretty successful. There was a number of key successes and key workings together, a number of resolutions of old disputes, and importantly, a disputes resolution procedure was, I can't remember if it was established before the election of 2010 or immediately afterwards, but certainly it was in the process of being established. There was a bit of tension as the election approached. You tend to, between governments, as an election approaches, there tends to be a bit of sensitivity, which perhaps immediately after the election there isn't. But basically, in credit to Prime Minister Brown, the system was re-established. Obviously, traditionally, historically, Gordon Brown had much more interest in devolution than Tony Blair had. And that situation improved again under Prime Minister Cameron. I saw that David is meeting the Foreign Minister of China this week. So perhaps we'll call that the golden age of the joint ministerial committees. And there were reasons for that, I think political reasons why that was the most successful period in the period from 2010 to 2014 of that system of intra-government cooperation. I should say, obviously, I think you should cooperate where you can. That's what we're here to do. To work for the best interests in terms of your responsibilities of the country or your constituency. Politically, I was very keen on seeing intra-government cooperation work because I wanted that to transition into inter-government cooperation. I saw it as part of a process leading to independence, so I wanted to see good cooperative structures which could then evolve into a British Council of States or whatever. And so I had a political end in mind, as well as wanting to see decent relationships where you could. Now, the last of the three periods, which, I mean, obviously I wasn't involved as a practicing politician, but as an intelligent layperson observing it, there seems to have been one of fairly total breakdown in relationships. Obviously, in doing my revision for this committee, I looked at various works that have been done on that, including the 2018 Public Administration Committee report, the unanimous report led by Bernard Jenkins, which put responsibility for that onto Brexit, and particularly the UK government's attitude to the devolved administrations in terms of the Brexit legislation. You may take a different view, but that was their view. I don't know how the new system, I mean, I read the detail of the new IGR system with the Secretariat. It looks pretty complicated. I mean, I get suspicious when I see something with flow diagrams, I wonder, But, maybe it's something that's only just coming in, so it's pretty early to judge, but it's certainly badly needed. I mean, there's certain examples, clearly public examples, during the COVID inquiry, for example, or David Cameron's extraordinary and out of character, in my view, letter about Hamza Yusuf in December, about Hamza meeting President Erdogan and the Prime Minister of Iceland. I mean, in a properly working system, people don't issue public rebukes of that kind. I'm sure that David's diplomacy, now he's Foreign Secretary, was much greater elsewhere. So there seems to have been a breakdown since then. But I would say the three phases: there was the initial falling into disuse after devolution, there was the establishment of what was always intended in the JMC system, and more recently, extreme difficulties as an observer, I see.
Great, well, and thank you for that. and thank you. I know you've had a bit of a journey to join us this morning, flying in from Berlin, but we're delighted that you're here and with us this morning. And I think you're absolutely right. That's what we've heard in this inquiry thus far. The three phases that you so adequately describe and define, I think, has been the characteristic of the devolution years. And yesterday we heard from three former Secretaries of State from that first period where it was a Labour government that was in place across all the parliaments and assemblies of the United Kingdom. And they sort of talked about intergovernment relationships being like defined by chats in the tea room or cosy evening chats on a Friday night. I'm supposing that when you became First Minister, those cosy evening Friday night chats on the phone would come to an end. And I'm just wondering, when you came into position, what was your view about how intergovernment relations were being discussed, and what did you make of the system that you inherited?
I didn't have the opportunity to see the evidence of yesterday. The old look back, the young look forward, the middle-aged look around. There is a tendency to look back to this great period of chumminess. That's not what I found when I took office. I found a huge number of unresolved disputes. Some were public. For example, the dispute on attendance allowance when Henry McLeish introduced free personal care. There was obviously a reduction in attendance allowance spending. Henry argued, I think rightly, that money should be allocated to Scotland to support the free personal care system, because there was no detriment to Westminster finances. That was unresolved. Famously, the Olympic regeneration funding. I mean, when I spoke to Rodri Morgan, when we were mutually congratulating each other on his re-election and my election, I think his first words to me were, "We've got to get the Olympic funding, Alec." Rodri, he pursued that heavily and publicly, and eventually, once we got the system established successfully, I think Rodri was out of office by then. There was other things which weren't public. I found a bill for tens of millions of pounds, I'm talking about high tens of millions of pounds, a claim for security costs for the Gleneagle Summit of 2005. Now, it was a ridiculous proposition if you think about it, because there are summits take place regularly in London with security implications. These are not barnetted You know, if there's money quite rightly spent on a summit in London, there's no share goes to Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. Therefore, if you choose to have the summit in Gleneagles, a great thing, 2005, the idea that suddenly Scotland should bear an element of the security costs struck me as far-fetched, and eventually that was dropped. So there was many disputes, some of which going back years, which had left unresolved. So ever the cosy chats were doing, they weren't resolving disputes. And also I find that I wouldn't say it was satisfactory to say you can replace or a system which was devised through joint ministerial committees by the opportunity to have chats. Apart from anything else, I mean, there is certainly an advantage, no question about it, that when negotiations were taking place between people who'd known each other for some time, who'd been part of this place, in the case of both Henry McLeish and myself, that would be the case. In the case of Rodri Morgan in Wales, that would be the case. Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland, that was the case. I mean, there are certain advantages in that, but it could never replace a proper system. And the idea that there was no disputes to be resolved is just untrue. There were many disputes. And to a certain extent, although the civil service, it's like the absence of JMC meetings. The civil service, get on with their business of cooperating on a day-to-day basis. But that was starting to affect relationships in the civil service as well as the absence of JMC meetings. I mean, when disputes lie unresolved over a matter of years, they become bones of contention.
From cosy chats, I think you said just this morning, I know you put something out in the press in the last few days, that there wasn't even a telephone call from Tony Blair to congratulate you in becoming First Minister. Did you find that rather odd and strange behaviour from a Prime Minister to a new First Minister who'd just been elected?
Well, I think he was upset. I think the Scottish elections of 2007 were the first elections he'd lost, the first parliamentary elections he lost, so I could only take it he was really miffed. But it is, I mean, famously, I think he said he never phones, he never writes, in answer to your colleague, Annabel Goldie, in the Parliament. And of course, it was very much to his detriment. And I should stress a totally different attitude to that of the incoming Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who, of course, I'd known for years, admittedly, but, is kind of strange behaviour. But much more seriously, of course, was the events that were taking place in the Libyan desert, in terms of personal discourtesies. Neither here nor there in some ways, but what was happening in the Libyan desert at the time was a very, very substantial breach of any devolution protocol.
Could you maybe explain? I mean, I've seen you refer to this in some of the exchanges you've had, but what specifically is it you're suggesting?
In late May 2007, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was in the desert in Libya with Colonel Gaddafi, simultaneously negotiating a prisoner transfer agreement and oil concessions for British Petroleum, and pretending or maintaining that there was no connection between the two. Subsequently, of course, we know there was and certainly in the minds of the Libyans, but in everybody else's mind as well, a very straight connection that the Libyans were expecting as a quid pro quo of agreeing to concessions for British Petroleum, that they would affect the release of Mr Megrahi from a Scottish prison. Now, there's two aspects to this. There's one aspect is that an appropriate way to deal with judicial matters? That's one aspect. But the second aspect, which you're interested in, is if you're negotiating a prisoner transfer agreement which affects Scotland, then you're under an obligation to let the Scottish authorities know. And of course it cut right across the whole Scottish judicial system. But to be fair, of course, the Prime Minister hadn't let his own cabinet colleagues know, never mind the Scottish Government. But it was, the policy issue is more substantial either than the personal discourtesy or the ethics of negotiating an oil deal and a prisoner transfer simultaneously.
And of course you were First Minister when the independence referendum took place and you negotiated the Edinburgh Agreement, of which you are a signatory. And this goes into the second part, the second phase that you described about the three parts of devolution. And I think everybody suspected that would be the most difficult and prickly of all the intergovernment relations that we would see in the course of the past 25 years. But witnesses have told us that there was almost like a golden age of devolution and intergovernment relations where everybody was working together and cooperating. Is that how you saw that?
Yeah, and I think it sounds counterintuitive, but when you actually think about it, it's not, because you've got to look at political motivations. Once the agreement had been set for the process by which independence would be voted on through the Edinburgh Agreement, then of course it was a political incentive for the Westminster government not to behave in a manner which would be seen to be overbearing, because it would have an impact on the Scottish electorate. I mean, for example, the example I gave earlier, I never received a letter from David Cameron in the manner he was addressing Hamza Yousaf in December, or just last December, about meeting other heads of state. I mean, it would have been very counterproductive for the Prime Minister to engage in that sort of activity. And of course, in terms of the Scottish Government, it was in the interest of the Scottish Government not to appear unreasonable, not to be obstreperous. So both governments had an interest in terms of trying to maximise their support in the run-up to the independence referendum, of not having silly fights about other things. And of course, because the main issue was going to be in the referendum, it meant that other things didn't have to be used as proxy power struggles, arm wrestling matches, and people just got on with it. So to a great extent it was. Although I would say, Peter, that that had been established, first with Gordon Brown and then with David Cameron before the Edinburgh Agreement. But you're quite right, counterintuitively, it was something of a golden age for intra-government relations.
Just lastly, looking at the conditions...
Clearly, obviously, we should have more referendum, and then we could have a golden age progressively.
We'll leave members of this committee, to decide their view on that particular issue. When you came to power, when you looked at intergovernment relations, was when you talked about trying to improve them from intra into inter, that was your objective and your mission when it comes to your constitutional ambitions for Scotland. What did you make of them when you saw intergovernment relations? Obviously, there's the three tiers, the government to government, the work that was going on between the standing committees and the work at official level. How did you assess them, and did you do anything practically to try and improve them? Maybe you could share with this committee.
I wrote to Gordon Brown immediately on his coming to office. I spoke to Gordon about it on the phone. And, as Chancellor, he wasn't, just like Jack Straw's Foreign Secretary wasn't aware of how much things had broken down. He thought they were all working because his area was working. Gordon wasn't necessarily very aware of there hadn't been there was no particular reason why he should be aware of that. But he was readily wanting to restore it. Sir John Elvidge, who was my Permanent Secretary, was very, very keen on restoring it for the reasons I said earlier. He felt it was starting to impinge on the civil service relationship, because there was running sores of disputes. And civil servants, by and large, like a forum where ministers are meeting and then they can go off and execute what was agreed, as opposed to having to make it up themselves. It was in very much there was a wish. And of course, I knew this beforehand because of the briefings that had taken place in the preparations for the election, and that's why I put it in the manifesto. So we actually had a manifesto commitment, which I executed. Now, look, it takes two to tango. I didn't have any success in the 6 weeks with Mr. Blair, but as soon as Gordon came into power, he was very willing to see the matter re-established. And as I said, there was a few tensions in the run-up to the 2010 election, and when David Cameron came in, he was extremely keen to see these relationships. And we had a very, very early plenary meeting in Downing Street, round the cabinet table, if I remember right.
Just lastly, just for completeness, obviously you refer to the third period of devolution, which has been the much more tetchy years in the last few years. I'm just wondering, as a former First Minister who had to deal with intergovernment relations, if you've got any views at all just about what you observe in the current condition of intergovernment relations?
Well, I mean, I don't have to. I took a note of what Bernard Jenkins' committee said, and it's worth perhaps going to the committee. Whitehall still operates extensively on the basis of a structure and culture which takes little account of the realities of devolution. And then in relation to Brexit, the same report said, it's highly regrettable there was little consultation with devolved government in advance of the publication of the European Withdrawal Bill, as earlier consultation could have possibly avoided much of the acrimony that was created between the UK government and the devolved governments. So that committee, to a great extent, put the responsibility for that breakdown around Brexit and the aftermath of Brexit onto the shoulders of the UK government. It's a unanimous report, so it should carry presumably some weight. You and I both have known Bernard for many years, and he was a very, very capable chair, and I was impressed by the report. So that was a very tense period, and the UK government, no doubt under a whole variety of pressures, neglected to do the very obvious thing and work out the implications of what they were doing for the devolved administrations. That seems clear. Now, the other example, I don't know if you want me to do this just now, but I was very struck by the letter that David Cameron wrote to, I think it was to Angus Robertson, but it was actually directed at Hamza Yusuf, complaining about the meeting with President Erdogan and the Prime Minister of Iceland. You see, not only I thought out of character, I think it was the previous Foreign Secretary, it was just left over and David signed it, I don't know, but I didn't recognise that in his character. But it's such a ridiculous proposition. Here's an example. 2013, the end of 2013, I was on a visit to China. And I was meeting, the reason for the meeting at high level, I had a personal friendship with Premier Li Keqiang, who had come to Edinburgh. He was an economist. And so, we more than other countries, we got access at the highest level. I just took a note of this this morning. At that time, the UK government were in the doghouse. David Cameron and Nick Clegg had met the Dalai Lama in secret at St Paul's Cathedral. The Chinese had taken offence, and there had been a year of very, very cool relations. Now, I was meeting Foreign Minister Yang, who was not a party official, he was a foreign minister. And I went to a meeting in the embassy the night before, and Sir Sebastian Wood, who was the British ambassador, asked if he could accompany me. In fact, he got his charge d'affaires, who's Scottish, to ask, into the meeting in the leadership compound in Beijing. No, because he hadn't been there for over a year. No, he'd been shut out. He'd been literally, metaphorically, literally in the doghouse, no contact. And I agreed. Why shouldn't I agree to that? If I could be of some service because of the position that I was able to have. And so we had the meeting. It was very successful, and within weeks, proper relations had been restored. David Cameron had a meeting here. He then had President Xi for a pint of beer, and the golden age of UK-China relations, short-lived golden age of UK-China relations then came on. Now look, I'm not making the point that wouldn't happen without that meeting in Beijing. No doubt some other means would have been found to do it, of course. But I didn't, sort of release, I'm not, as you know, press-averse, but I didn't release a press statement saying, look what I've done, or write a snotty letter to the Prime Minister saying, ha, ha, ha. That sort of courtesy was a two-way process. I did it because I knew that there'd be other...
I wouldn't break your train of thought, but just, are you maybe suggesting that First Ministers could be used as possible ambassadorial diplomatic tools and means to try and resolve some?
Well, that's what happened. And it was just to get the ambassador into the leadership compound so as they could re-establish. Now, the Chinese were going to do it anyway. People only stay in the doghouse for a point of time. The point I'm making is I did that without, fanfare, or without trying to make, because, until this moment, I've never talked about that publicly. But because I knew that there would be other occasions where I required the help of a British ambassador, perhaps in a circumstance I was less familiar with, and needed their expertise and their help and their staff to assist in what I was doing. And it was a reciprocal thing. There was no detriment to Scotland in Sir Sebastian Wood being in that meeting. And nothing I said to the Foreign Minister of China about Scottish independence was going to be a surprise to the British ambassador. There was no restraint on the meeting. The meeting actually was conducted in English. The only time that ever happened in my experience of a Chinese minister. But he was a very, Foreign Minister Yang was a very erudite and qualified, studied at the LSE, and he was a very interesting humorous man. And he, so the meeting was conducted in English. There was no restraint on the meeting. There was no detriment to me having the British ambassador there. And therefore, this idea that, Hamza must be chaperoned when he goes to meet, the Icelandic Prime Minister. What is he going to say to the Icelandic Prime Minister that she's going to be unaware of? I think it's symptomatic. If you compare that with, that's 2013 with now, it's symptomatic of a very sharp deterioration in relationships. Now, maybe, of course, now when David Cameron is in, get his feet under the table as Foreign Secretary, he'll go back to the attitude he had in 2013.
Well, we will see. Thank you for that. Alan Brown.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Hi, Alec. Alec, you spoke about when you took over some unresolved disputes, and there's no formal mechanism really for resolving them. Obviously, the COSA chats weren't actually working. Am I right in thinking there was also an issue with budget underspends, that if the then Scottish Government, if they hadn't spent the full allocation of the budget, Westminster was effectively holding on to that, and that was another matter that had to get resolved?
And was resolved, Alan. It was a big problem for the then Labour Liberal administration, and that was resolved as part of an agreement with the Treasury that you could have more financial flexibility in terms of if there was an underspend, it could be carried over to the next year. So there was more flexibility. That was a negotiation that took place between the finance ministers and was successfully carried out. I would suspect that a reason, thinking back, that it hadn't been resolved previously is because there wasn't the formal mechanisms in place. I mean, one of the great gains of that period of resuming the GMCs and the formal meetings was the dispute resolution procedure. Because I think in total, checking back as I did last week, I think we had 5 issues which were to go to the dispute mechanism which was established in 2010. Only one of them went the full way. And it's really interesting that, because when it be the UK government or, for that matter, a devolved administration is putting forward a, how shall we describe it, an adventurous position, right? You won't go to the full way of a dispute mechanism because you'll end up, getting your exam paper marked adversely. So it has a way of resolving itself. And the only one that actually did go all the way on my checking was indeed Rodney Morgan's favourite subject of the Olympic spending. I should say this is not the Olympic Games itself. This was the infrastructure about the Games, which by the rules of the Barnett formula should have been Barnetted. There should have been a coefficient. And Rodney Morgan, I think he'd left office by the time, was right. He didn't get, for the devolved administrations, as much as he'd hoped. But nonetheless, in the principle, he was correct. And it wasn't an insignificant sum. It was tens of millions for Scotland and probably about half that for Wales. So that went to a dispute. And I think the agreement to have flexibility in the finances also came about because of the meetings of the finance ministers and the agreement between the officials that was able to come about.
And you said for Olympics here that was like tens of millions of pounds in Barnet. Do you remember how much the finance agreement in terms of underspend, how much money that freed up?
Oh, very substantial, much more than that. I mean, you would potentially, without that flexibility, I mean, I'm sure that a great deal was made of it politically. I probably made a great deal of it politically. But, it's not that difficult in a budget of, then, what would it be, 40, 50 billion, to undershoot by high hundreds of millions. So that's not, it's also quite possible to go the other way. So the flexibility is the important thing. But it would be a matter of billions that was worth over a period of time to Scotland not to have the undershoot docked from the Scottish Government finances. Incidentally, since you're on finance, Alan, I think a very serious thing has occurred since that period we're talking about, since 2014, and this the new financial structures which have evolved since the Smith Commission report, which I think are vastly detrimental to the devolved administrations. Basically because the Barnett formula, I mean, it's a bit like what's it, Palmerston on the Schleswig-Holstein question. Only 3 people understood it. One's mad, one's dead, and I've forgotten. Well, actually, I haven't forgotten. I understand the Barnett formula. I had reason to understand it for many reasons. Now, what's happened is Barnett's been qualified by a growth reward system. And because the devolved administrations are unlikely to be growing as fast as the southeast of England, and because their growth potential is determined by UK fiscal policy and, in the case of Scotland, the performance of the energy industry, if there's a penalty for low growth, as there is within the formula now, then that can be severely detrimental to Scottish finances. It's an adjustment to the Barnett formula, which is a huge impost in Scotland at the present moment. And how it was, you could only have ever agreed this, either from a position of great political weakness or total innumeracy, or both. And the fact that that has now been subject to a review and agreed again, I find totally bewildering, and it would certainly not have been agreed in the period you're talking about when we were actually negotiating flexibility in Scotland's finances.
In terms of intergovernment relations or planning, if we go back to Barnett Forum, certainly Barnett Forum as was, obviously a lot of the money that gets released through the Barnett Forum is because UK government decides a need in England and where they're going to spend money in England, then Scotland gets a pro rata share, or if it's a budget overspend, Scotland might eventually get a pro rata share. And therefore at a budget, Scotland's meant to be grateful for the Barnett. But is that not an impossible way to actually plan long-term finances as well?
It's difficult. I mean, there are certain advantages to it, but not the advantages that you would have in terms of flexibility and overall command of your budget and fiscal policy. Remember, the Barnett is about the increase or decrease in spending. It's a pro rata, as you put it, an adjusted population share of the increase, not the whole, but of the increase or decrease. But whatever you might think the limitations of Barnett, which you're quite right, are no substitute for what you might have elsewhere. The fact that it's been adjusted in this terms of growth imposition. I mean, what's happening if your economy is growing more slowly, as it has been recently, in terms of the UK, which is affected very much by the southeast of England growth? It's a double penalty. You think if things weren't going as well as they should, you would get a bonus to say, right, this will help you, pull things up. Actually, what happens is a double penalty at the present moment. And, I always saw a calculation, which I've no reason to doubt, it's not my calculation, that of the sort of £1 billion of additional spending that the Scottish Government has raised from increased taxation, about 90% of it has been swallowed up by deductions through the growth formula that's been put into Barnett. Just think of that. I mean, it's a huge difficulty, and I've no idea why if that had been proposed to me back then, it would have been in the disputes procedure forever and a day, I can tell you.
Can I take you back to devolution, the concept of making devolution work? Because yesterday we had a lot of evidence, and the kind of view from those given evidence yesterday from Scottish Secretary of State positions was that now relationships are broken down because basically the SNP as a government don't want devolution to work. Now you've actually already set your stall out that you wanted devolution to work as part of that pathway to independence and actually having positive government structures. But I'll take you back to, I don't know if you remember this, this is an interview Lord Fowkes gave in February 2008. Obviously now Baron Fowkes of Cumnock, who was very interested in yesterday's proceedings, and he said the SNP are on a very dangerous tack. What they're doing is trying to build up a situation in Scotland where the services are manifestly better than south of the border in a number of areas. The interviewer, Colin Mackay, then asked, is that a bad thing? And Lord George Fowkes says, no, but they're doing it deliberately. So is that very much an attitude, let's make it work, but let's actually improve services?
Yes, it was, and I think I probably reminded Baron Fowkes of it a number of times, because he was in the Scottish Parliament, of course, for 4 years, between 2007. Unexpectedly, I think. I don't think he expected to be there. He was on the list in the Lothians for the Labour Party, but I probably reminded him of it quite a few times. But yeah, I mean, my idea was that, one of the key, not the only, but one of the key components of building the case for independence was to govern the country competently. On the basis that people thought you could run the shop, then they would have more confidence in running the areas that the devolved parliament wasn't in charge of. So to build confidence, and that meant running things productively and progressively. Why they've broken down recently? Well, again, I pointed, they're not broken down recently because there's been a defined referendum date or process to independence. They're broken down perhaps because there hasn't been. Because many subjects perhaps are used as arm wrestling bouts as a proxy for the constitutional argument. Now, there have been key difficulties in that period, remember. Obviously Brexit, obviously COVID, which perhaps have put additional strains on the intergovernmental relations. But I can't help feeling that in the absence of a defined process, and lots of arguments, which otherwise would have just been settled or agreed, become somehow proxies for an overall constitutional battle. So perhaps the best idea would be to have a defined process, like in Northern Ireland, for example.
Can I just take back to intergovernment relations at an official level? So you already said your Permanent Secretary, Sir John Elbridge, had some frustrations. So what was the working relationship like between the officials, and did it improve during that period?
Yes, rather than me cite Sir John, if the committee goes back to his evidence, because he gave evidence with me 10 years ago, and you can see exactly what he said and how he couched it in civil service language. John was a very powerful Permanent Secretary, as was his successor, Peter Housden. And they regarded what they were seeking for the Scottish administration was parity of esteem. They wanted, not pretending to be an independent government, but they wanted parity of esteem for a government. They wanted intra-governmental relations to be carried forward on that basis. And therefore they've devoted themselves to ensuring the prestige of their departments and carried themselves as Permanent Secretary in that manner. I'm not at all certain their successor did that. If you treat yourself as another UK government department, then you shouldn't be surprised if other UK government departments start seeing you in that way. And Sir John Elbridge, Sir Peter Housden, would not have seen their job every Wednesday to be at interdepartmental meetings down here, as their successor did. They regarded their job as making sure the Scottish government was running effectively, properly, and have parity of esteem with negotiations. They didn't regard the Scottish government as another UK Whitehall department.
And yet you'll be aware, despite that, you'll be aware that at the moment there are some accusations that the civil servants working for the Scottish government aren't impartial anymore, and Richard Hardy, the National Secretary for Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Prospect, Dave Penman, General Secretary of FDA, have actually both expressed concern about the impartiality of civil servants in Scotland being questioned. Now, obviously, you managed the build-up to the referendum. There's a government white paper. Was there any difficulties in terms of, again, officials that are working for the Scottish government are elected by the Scottish electorate, so therefore the Scottish government responding to the wishes of the electorate effectively. Was there any issues of that accusation of impartiality or politicisation of the civil service back then?
Well, there was certainly a controversy. Some people, Baron Fultz, for example, found it difficult to adjust to the idea that a civil service working for a government who'd been elected on a mandate to seek Scottish independence should work as the government wished to try and formulate the independence plan. As I remember it, he can still speak for himself. You'll summon him before your committee. But Baron Fultz wasn't fully adjusted to that idea. But most people, and certainly the key people involved, which is Sir John Elbridge, he made that clear from day one, that the government had been elected, therefore it was the duty of the civil service to affect that government's policy as best he could. And of course that's the way it has to be.
Did other UK civil servants reporting to the UK government respect that as well?
Well, they were obviously working to a different agenda. That's where it comes to the parity of esteem and mutual respect comes in. People can have disagreements in a negotiation as long as everybody knows which side they're on. in the negotiation, then you come to an agreement and you move on. I mean, I think it's true, as you'll see from Sir John Elbridge's evidence, they much preferred the dispute, if there was a dispute, or the argument to be between the ministers, and then once there was the agreement, they could go off and implement it. And they were absolutely delighted, obviously, with the Edinburgh Agreement, because it cleared the way for what exactly was happening, and they could go on with the Independence White Paper, the agreement of mutual respect, and all the rest of it. Once the ministers had come to the decision, the civil service on both sides of the border were good. My own impression of the UK civil service in terms of the problems is forgetfulness. I think some departments forget then about Scottish implications for what they're doing, rather than there was at that stage some great conspiracy in Whitehall departments to do Scotland down or do Wales down or do Northern Ireland down. They just forgot it was there. And again, the ministerial meetings help. But remember, when you have a ministerial meeting, right, it means that department is not consumed by the Joint Ministerial Council, but the Cabinet Office. If there was a plenary meeting of the JMC, that would be a major event that was coming up that the Cabinet Office had to plan for, to make sure it was carried forward properly, look at all the implications, prepare the briefing papers. Nobody in the Cabinet Office would forget there was devolved implications when they were organising a GMC plenary meeting, and similarly with the other departments. So in a way, the GMC's resumption was important to stop the absent-mindedness of Whitehall departments, in my opinion.
Thank you. Venture from Douglas.
Response to Mr Brown was asking you about your policies and the actions you took as First Minister in your government. So you believe it was your progressive policies and delivery should be celebrated in your time as First Minister?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
always suspicious of questions like that, because is he leading me on to a killer riposte?
Well, not really. It's just looking at the facts rather than your own assumptions and your own calculations of your time in office. I mean, education, PISA rankings in reading, maths and science fell throughout your time as First Minister. Drug deaths increased from 2007 to 2014, and of course you agreed the contracts to build 2 ferries that still aren't servicing the islands they were supposed to work for. Is that the type of delivery you think should be celebrated?
Just on the third one, I had no part or agreement on the contracts for the ferries. If you check the record,
you had no part at all. You didn't.
No. They were agreed after the contracts for the ferries were. Some time after I left office, Douglas, check the record.
Well, just on that point then, if we're going to argue that point,
I'm not arguing.
You were involved in the earlier stages to secure the contract going to that yard.
Right, well, okay, let me give you a bit of time scale. The saving of the Ferguson yard took place in August, September 2014.
Just for the referendum.
Just before the referendum, yeah. I left office in November 2014. I promise you, the 2 ferry contracts, I mean, I don't know where they were in the EFOR, but they certainly weren't anywhere near the civil service. They were negotiated sometime after I left office. Now,
you were involved in the nationalisation of that yard?
No. I was involved in saving the yard, and a private business took over the yard. The nationalisation of the yard was 4 years later. I mean, it's many people like me who are looking back over the last 20 years that get my dates mixed up, Douglas. You're meant to be on the spot and on the ball. 2 parliaments, it'd be quite exhausting going back and forward.
Well, fortunately, you don't have that problem anymore since you're not sitting in either. But I just wonder about that point. You were involved in the early stages, but if you don't want to...
Let me be quite exact.
Alec, what we'll do here is we'll ask questions and we'll get answers, and then we'll be able to move on. Douglas.
So on the point then, if you'd like to not focus on ferries, on education and drug deaths, did drug deaths increase?
I want you to acknowledge, Douglas, that your assumption about my involvement in the ferry contracts was incorrect. It's manifestly incorrect. I won't ask you to apologise because you're not a minister. I'm sure you're not deliberately misleading the committee. I just want you to acknowledge that your memory had failed you.
Well, I'm going to speak about education.
No, I want you to acknowledge first.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do that.
Well, you're good.
Mr. Salmond,
Mr.
Salmond,
Order. Stop, please, both of you. What we'll do is we'll ask questions, we'll secure responses, and then we'll move on to the next member of the committee. If we could conduct our proceedings in that manner, I'm sure it'll be much more productive. Douglas.
I'm not surprised Mr. Salmond doesn't want to talk about the ferries, because obviously that has been a serious issue throughout his time in government and subsequent governments.
Not about my time in government.
I do want to focus on education then, because Scotland's PISA rankings dropped in reading, maths and science from 2007 to 2014 throughout your time in office, and drug deaths increased from 2007 to 2014. They've increased even further since then. Is that the type of delivery you believe is competent government?
Well, I could go through I keep seeing a list of various things that the government, which I was in charge of, put forward, because they're still being repeated today. But rather than you and I bandy it about, Douglas, surely the record of my government in office was tested in the 2011 election, where for the first and only time in devolution history, under a proportional system, the government was elected with an absolute majority in a PR system. So rather my judgment or your judgment, that was the judgment of the people at that stage, having seen the record of an SNP administration for the very period that Alan asked me about and the very period that Baron Fultz was commenting on.
Well, I know why Mr. Brown asked you that, but I'm just wondering, what's your reflections on the number of people who died in Scotland as a result of drug misuse during your time as First Minister? Is that something you regret?
I think it's appalling. The area of drug misuse is a huge social issue. I welcome the fact that there's a change in approach and engagement with it. At that time, when I was in office, the deaths from alcohol abuse were greater than the deaths from drug abuse. They crossed in a curve afterwards, and we were extremely focused on that as a major social issue. The drug policy, I've been involved in since Michael Forsyth launched his war on drugs in 1997, was it? Yeah. And I'm not certain. The whole range of things, Douglas, that we haven't got to grips with, which are not superficial things, they're profound things. But there's no administration over that period of time can claim credit for solving the extreme difficulty that Scotland has with drug abuse.
And Scotland's international reputation for excellence in education, it did fall under your time as First Minister.
But the international reputation for excellence in education would also look at university rankings and college rankings, which rose very considerably. And I think, incidentally, in terms of the amount of opportunity that youngsters in Scotland had to take part in that, had a significant advance from the abolition of any form of tuition fee, which gives Scottish students a huge advantage over elsewhere. But look, I'm very happy. Look, I'll debate with you the record of the SNP government between 2007 to 2014 till the cows come home.
Just finally on that point,
this committee, I assumed, was interested in the subject matter for which it was called.
Exactly.
But I've been known occasionally in your place as now, Douglas, to wander off into other subjects. But please, on you go.
Yeah, well, I was just coming in on the back of Mr. Brown, who was asking, and you're very happy to answer the question when it was put positive.
No.
So just
Douglas,
can I just ask?
I'm very happy
Mr. Salmond.
Mr. Salmond. Any of your questions,
Order. This is not helpful to people who are listening to these proceedings.
Indeed.
So we please conduct them much more orderly. Douglas, lastly.
I'm just wondering, and you speak about university education, but I presume you respect and acknowledge the PISA rankings, and therefore what is your view on maths, reading and science? Scotland falling down the international rankings during your time in office. It was a downward trajectory for 2007 to 2014.
Firstly, I deprecate those who don't acknowledge the successes of Scottish education. We should be able to acknowledge failings as well, but Scottish education is not, as you describe it very often in your public statements. Scottish education has an exceptional advance for many, many young people in Scotland. And the proof of that, of course, is if you look at the destinations of youngsters in Scotland in terms of work.
Not just look at the PISA rankings that I'm asking about.
I know I'm answering your question about education, Douglas. That has risen progressively and successively, and we should be pleased at that. While
why is it so difficult for you to answer about PISA
distance
rankings?
Still to travel in a range of areas. But, Douglas, across the range of things that the government did with 2007-2014, I think public in Scotland were pretty satisfied with the overall performance.
You just don't want to answer about the bad bits.
Right, I think we've exhausted that line of questioning. Thank you. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. Good morning, I think it still is, Mr. Salmond. It's nice to see you again. Returning to the machinery of the IGR, in 2007, as you've already said, you sought to revive that, including the Joint Ministerial Committee. You've mentioned already that your motivation was independence. You wanted to move Scotland towards independence. I think it would be fair to say that at the same time, the UK government's motivation would be to avoid independence. So, to what extent do you think that if we moved into a golden period, as you've said, that it was because we had two governments with a joint aim, and that, in a way, one, they had something in common. One was to pursue independence, and the other was to avoid it. So the issue of independence united them on something that they had to make work for their own motivations, and that the UK government was as motivated to make it work as you were.
Well, I mean, I did say earlier on, Christine, that in addition to good governance, which I think is a good thing to have, and I mentioned, as constituency MPs, you pursue that as well as pursuing your political ends. But I think there's a great deal of truth in the fact that once the process of the independence referendum was settled and agreed, it meant that both governments had an incentive to be on their best behaviour. Let's put it that way. I think that, and as I said earlier, it was counterintuitive. It's not necessarily what you might have expected, but nonetheless, I think on all sides it's agreed that's what happened. And I thought that was very useful. In my view, good governance, whether it be the government of Scotland or it be the relationships with Westminster, was actually helpful to the case I was trying to put forward, which was one that relationships could be good and could be good after independence as they were before independence. I had no premium whatsoever in seeing two governments at war over things that mattered. Look, politics is politics. You can't stop politicians being politicians. But when people are in charge of negotiating, settling things that are going to matter to a lot of people, if at all possible, people should sit down and get on with it, basically.
What particular steps did you take to try to improve the situation post-2007 when you had the GMC was up working again? What particular steps did you take to try and improve the intergovernment relationship?
Well, we've already spoke about Sir Anthony Blair's period. That was beyond my ken, okay? But as soon as Gordon came into office, I think I wrote to him on day one. And I'd spoken to him on the phone when we were mutually congratulating each other on our offices, etc. So he was very willing, to see it re-established and thought it was a good move. And as you rightly say, from a different perspective, but nonetheless. And Gordon, of course, traditionally and historically, was somebody who's very interested in devolution, had been for many, many years. So once you've got people willing to do it, and then of course we've also got to remember the situation in Northern Ireland. Fairness, the Northern Irish executive was coming back out of abeyance at that time, and Dr. Paisley and Martin McGuinness were re-establishing the executive, and I had a very good relationship with both of them for different reasons, but and went out of my way to help them, which I think anybody at all sensible would want you to do. So things were happening which allowed that whole GMC process to have great meaning. And of course, there's no doubt that from a devolved administration point of view, whether you're Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, it's very helpful when all three administrations are functioning, because more often than not, you'll have a similar concern about an issue, which makes the meetings less challenging than otherwise they might be.
One of the things we heard from the witnesses yesterday, they all said quite categorically that in the period before what you described as a golden age, in the period up to 2007, they saw that as, in a way, as a golden age, that there was a lot of collaboration, that there was a great spirit of collaborating to make devolution work. And in your own evidence today, you've told us that Gordon Brown was much more effective than Tony Blair, and David Cameron, again, you got on with. So that again seems to point back to personal relationships, that it's down to the individuals in both governments to take a collaborative view, whether it's because they're motivated by independence or avoiding independence, but to take a collaborative view to work together rather than the actual mechanisms.
I saw something from your colleague Lord Wallace in evidence he gave. I wasn't sure if it was written or oral evidence, perhaps. Right, okay. Then he said something like, he didn't think the GMC planning meetings were really effective. And one of the meetings, Tony Blair was staring out the window. But the phrase struck me, okay? Well, I was very puzzled by this because, if I'd been meeting Tony Blair, he might have been jumping out the window, but he certainly wouldn't have been staring out the window. Because I remember the first meeting with Gordon and with David Cameron later, went on the whole agenda, this needs solved, that needs solved. And actually, you got quite a bit of way down the list before they sort of said, give us peace. But so I found that very difficult because I know, I was opposition leader and I was back in here at that time. There were plenty of issues going on. And but I think it's much more something, in my opinion, that I don't think Tony Blair was particularly interested in that sort of thing. He had other things in mind, countries to invade, that sort of stuff. But there's no question that when Gordon Brown came in, there was a sea change in attitude and re-establishment of the committees. Things got a bit tense as we approached the election of 2010 for political rivalries, and when David Cameron came in, he was extremely keen on establishing and demonstrating that that sort of relationship was possible. I'll give you a very good example, which is one that I was talking about Jim Wallace and I pursued for many years as opposition MPs down here, and that was Scottish ministers at the Council of Ministers in Europe. And particularly fishing was usually the subject where things came to a head because and at that first meeting I had with David Cameron, which would be after the 2010 election, I raised this perennial issue and pointed out there was a Fisheries Council meeting about to occur where on pelagic fishing, where, as you'll know well, David, Scotland had about 90% of the catching capacity, and the other boats, the three English boats at that time, were all Dutch owned. So basically it had all of the UK interests, if you like. I think there was one boat in Northern Ireland at the time. And yet Richard Lochhead wasn't even guaranteed to be at the meeting, never mind leading the delegation. And David Cameron and William Hague at that meeting agreed that Richard Lochhead would lead the UK delegation for that issue of pelagic fishing, which I don't think was unprecedented. I think it had happened once before in the dim distant past, but was a fairly spectacular breakthrough as far as the fishing industry was concerned. It should be said that thereafter, DEFRA launched a counter-offensive, if I can put it that way, and started to chip away at the idea this would happen on a regular basis. But nonetheless, it was an example of how. Now, you never got that from a meeting of officials. That had to be a Prime Ministerial and Foreign Secretary decision. But that happened at the first plenary meeting that took place after the election.
I know on the issue of fishing, there's a supplementary from Mr Duke, if you don't mind. Yeah. Do you want to pursue the fishing?
No, I would like to pursue this, and then I'm happy to.
Wait.
So from what you're saying, what you're telling the committee, these meetings were, you believe, incredibly useful and were used for settling issues like that you don't believe could have been effectively settled other ways?
Right. Absolutely correct. Okay. I mean, that's the sort of thing which has to be settled by Prime Minister.
So it was important that everyone had a positive attitude to them.
Yeah, agreed. And also, my experience in politics, most people, not everybody of course, but most people, if they can do something without great detriment to their own position, then their attitude would be, if you've established decent relationships, why not do it?
Well, the problem I have with that, if you don't mind me saying so, Mr. Salmond, is that from my research and my personal memory of the time, that wasn't the feeling, particularly in the UK government, about many of these meetings. And in fact, in May 2012, there's a great deal of press coverage about the fact that the UK government was unhappy that you had chosen to go to make a speech in Aberdeen rather than come to the JMC where all the other First Ministers were going to come to, and that they were critical of your attitude. So you mentioned earlier that the elderly tend to look back, the young look forward, and the middle-aged look around. Do you think perhaps in looking back on these years, you're looking at them slightly through rose-tinted glasses and not appreciating that it wasn't quite the golden age that you think, and that there was more that could have been done, and that perhaps could have been done?
Well, my memory of it seems to chime reasonably well with that of David Cameron's, which I suppose is the two accounts that really matter in this. Obviously, politics doesn't stop. In terms of attendance at JMC meetings, Christina, I mean, I don't know if I'd have got the gold star, but certainly I'd have been the silver star or better. And British Irish Council meetings as well, because they were great opportunities for Scotland to progress our case in a whole range of ways. I don't think, look, politics doesn't come to a halt just because an institution is re-established. But what I think happens is needless arguments that don't have to be there, can get removed from the agenda. And to a certain extent, I mean, these are beyond politics. I mean, Rodri Morgan, I've mentioned it a number of times already, but his bugbear about the Olympic spending really stuck in his craw. He was determined, and the fact he was a Labour politician didn't alter the fact he was determined to get what he saw as the just share from Wales from infrastructure spending, come what may.
Given all of that, given that you believe that it was successful, that re-establishing the GMC worked, that the meetings worked, that David Cameron recognised that they worked, and as Prime Minister, he saw the opportunity to ensure a good, positive relationship with Scotland from Westminster to the benefit of the people of Scotland. I think it was Lord Brown said yesterday that everybody was in it because they wanted the best for Scotland. Mm-hmm. Why do you think now, by your own statement earlier on, we're no longer in a golden age of relationships between the UK government and the Scottish government? We still have the GMC, but why is it no longer working effectively, by your own admission, for both the governments and for the people of Scotland, who ultimately are the losers if there's a bad relationship between the two governments? Well,
I think the stresses and strains from Brexit and COVID, right? I was very impressed by the fairness of Bernard Jenkins' committee on this, and I think most observers would say when it came to Brexit and its aftermath, and of course, to be fair, it would be very difficult to build up a relationship with any single Prime Minister if we remember the progression. In fact, I mean, one of the Prime Ministers actually campaigned on the issue. She wasn't going to speak. She wasn't going to speak to the Scottish First Minister at the time. So the Brexit issue would put particular strains on things. But I think the underlying thing here is that the other issues are used as boundary disputes. That the UK government, one of the reasons that myself and your colleagues, Alistair Carmichael and I think Jim Wallace as well, used to argue for the removal of the Secretary of State, is that the Secretary of State was supernumerary to the relationships between the UK departments and the GMC process, the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister, and was kind of getting in the way. And that even happened, when John Reid was Secretary of State and Donald Dewar was First Minister, when they were engaged in a fairly ferocious battle at one stage. And therefore it would be much better for the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments to deal directly. And probably one of the very few things I agreed with Tony Blair on is at one point he wanted to establish a Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs and remove the territorial aspect of things. But so I think boundary disputes are what causes the acrimony. If the UK government, after the withdrawal from the European Union, instead of what had been generally supposed that the areas of spending, European spending, would be fairly automatically devolved in terms of regeneration spending, unless there was some particular aspect to it. And basically what's happened, is it not, as I understand it, is most of that spending has been accumulated in Whitehall and now directed on things which traditionally the devolved administrations would see themselves as responsible for.
So it's all the UK government?
No, I didn't say it was all the UK government. I'm just saying that the advance into the other side's turf in recent years looks to me, and looked to the Public Administration Committee, wouldn't it be, to be an advance or the actions of the UK government. But I'm just observing things. But I also think that in the absence of an agreed process by which, the golden age, as we're referring to it, there was an agreed process in the Edinburgh Agreement. Maybe it's the agreed process by which the constitutional aim can be properly democratically pursued is what's required.
Proper dispute resolution mechanism, perhaps?
The dispute resolution mechanism, which was established in 2010, worked very well. As I mentioned, there was 5 disputes went to it. Only one went the full way because the various sides dropped theirs when they realised they were going to get beaten. And the only one that went the full hog, as I remember it, was the Olympic regeneration money.
If we put aside the Olympic regeneration thing, what I'm taking from what you're saying is that what we need for good relations between the Scottish and the UK government and for devolution to work effectively is people on both sides who want it to work, who have a motivation for making it work, and a dispute resolution mechanism, and for us all to forget boundary disputes.
Yes, I read, as you will have, the new format, and it's there. There is a dispute. There's a secretariat as well. But it looks pretty complicated, doesn't it? I mean, just as an observation,
No charts again.
Sorry.
No diagrams again.
Yes, but nonetheless, there is a dispute. And but the key dispute mechanism was the one that Alan Brown referred to. Is to find a dispute mechanism with the Treasury is probably more important than any other dispute mechanism.
Thanks for that. I know it was several minutes ago, but you still want to have your very brief supplementary.
Very briefly, just a single question. Mr. Salmond, you mentioned the fisheries earlier as the current Member of Parliament for Banff-and-Buchan and the recovering member for Banff-and-Buchan and still a resident. I guess it's inevitable that fisheries might come up. And I recognised what you said there about the difficulty of people getting into the room. As was the case when the UK was a member state of the EU. It was often expressed, that frustration, that even UK government ministers and negotiators couldn't get into the room, particularly for annual coastal state negotiations. So, on that basis, would you agree with Elspeth MacDonald, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, who in evidence to this committee, agreed or stated that since leaving the EU, and the UK becoming an independent coastal state, that the strength and power of Scottish government negotiators in those negotiations has actually never been so strong since coming out of the CFP?
Well, I would, what's the optimum position for Scottish fishing, right? The optimum position is to control the resource and to have guaranteed access to markets, right? When the Common Fisheries Policy was in sway, and you'll remember, I'm sure, my views on the Common Fisheries Policy, then you had access to the markets, untrammelled access to markets, and guaranteed access to markets, but the resource wasn't controlled. Currently, the resource, as you say, between the UK is controlled, but the access to markets can be questioned and can be questionable. and at a point of dispute could be undermined. If you look at the Norwegian situation, they both control the resource and have access to markets. My own view is that's where we'd like to, well, from a fisheries point of view, that would be the optimum position. I mean, I hope and believe, no doubt, with your urging and campaigning, because as you'll understand, my former fishing constituents are still very dear to me, and they will be to you as well. So I'm hoping that the situation is progressive and they're having their vital.
But do you agree? Sorry,
interest.
forgive me, but the question was: do you agree with Elspeth MacDonald that the Scottish fishing industry, in terms of the annual coastal state negotiations, have a stronger voice in those negotiations?
Well, I hope they get the results they're looking for. I mean, I read fishing news as you do. I mean, I've been reading about a range of issues at the present moment which look problematic, and on the pelagic side, incidentally, as well.
If I could push you on a yes or no, do you agree with Elspeth MacDonald?
I don't. I mean, I'd love to agree with the SFF, but I would have to study the matter to see. But I see issues unresolved still in the fishing industry, but no doubt with your endeavours, they'll come to a beneficial conclusion.
Didn't do too badly, we'll leave it there. Thank you. Anam Kaiser.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Alec, for joining us today. If I reflect on my own experiences of growing up in Scotland, there's been times when foreign policy has come to the forefront of politics. And the Iraq War comes to mind, and of course you were incredibly vocal against the Iraq War, as were many in Scotland. So in your view, how did this policy impact how Scots felt represented at Westminster, but also in intergovernment relations?
Well, I mean, the Iraq War was before I was First Minister, but you're quite right. The reverberations from the disputes in Iraq continued through politics, continue to this day. And obviously the situation in Gaza is a huge concern and a very pertinent issue in this Parliament right now. It does have an impact. There's no doubt about that. It certainly, I mean, I don't know if Tony Blair liked me before Iraq, but he certainly never liked me afterwards, and so it has an impact on interpersonal relationships. But on a policy position, I mean, that letter I was talking about, the one I think was very atypical of David Cameron, he talks about how it's vital that the UK have a single position. But the UK doesn't have a single position. I understand it, and it's not meant to be, but I understand there may be a difference in Sir Keir Starmer's position in upcoming votes than there has been, or a slight change, however he wants to describe it. I mean, that's not the point I'm going to make. But it's expected that Sir Keir Starmer will always have the same position as the government. If Hamza Yousaf meets another foreign leader, is that foreign leader going to be unaware that Hamza Yousaf might have a different position from the UK government? What is to be gained or added to by saying the UK must have a single position, when manifestly the UK, neither in terms of parties nor in terms of administrations, has a single position? Foreign leaders are quite able to make the distinction between a devolved government and the UK government of Westminster. You don't have to send in your First Minister with a gag in his mouth telling him not to speak out of turn like a naughty boy. That's not required. So we should be much more relaxed about people having different positions. But you're quite right, these issues can reverberate through politics for a long time, and I suspect the current tragedy in Gaza is going to reverberate through politics, and it's not particularly a failure of UK leadership, although it is that. It's a failure of world leadership that this situation has been allowed to develop in the way it has.
And thank you for talking about Gaza, because that's exactly what I was going to go on to. There's no words to describe the situation. We've obviously seen over 28,000 people killed by Israeli authorities, including women and children. People across all four nations have engaged in the political process. My inbox is full of my Airdrie and Shotts constituents who are furious at Westminster for not reflecting their views. And there's also been conversation in Westminster, you may have heard, of pro-ceasefire marches being banned or restricted. Yet, of course, up in the Scottish Parliament, we had a vote on this matter. So following on from what I just asked previously, what should happen moving forward in terms of politicians being able to work together? Because we're clearly seeing two governments, two parliaments with very different attitudes on when it comes to the relation of Gaza.
Quite interesting, take an analogy in the Iraq War. One of the best early debates in the Scots Parliament was the debate on Iraq. And because it was one of the times when the Parliament was able to lift itself from some of the issues which had preoccupied the early days of the Parliament, like the building and all the rest of it, onto a different level. And there was absolutely, I remember a speech by George Reid, which was a compelling speech. So we should be frightened of these issues. On the contrary, I think they have to be articulated well. The conference I've just returned from in Berlin was not preoccupied with this issue alone, but obviously it was a major part of it. And the idea, there's nobody I think can take credit in the world at the present moment for their overall attitude, but some people have stood out, and I thought Uachtaráin Higgins and his willingness to, for a small country in Europe to say to the European president that her attitude was not shared across the European Union in the early stages of this was a very important statement. So people should speak out because they should do their best to reflect the popular will. And the popular will, not just in this country, not just in Scotland, but across the world, is to stop the slaughter in Gaza. More strength to the elbow of everybody who's doing it. And also restrictions. Remember, there was legislation to restrict marches around the Scots Parliament I never understood. I found ridiculous.
Just before we go on, sorry, Alec, the members can ask any questions that they like, and it's interesting to hear your recollections and your views about such issues. But just gently remind colleagues that we're here to hear Mr Salmond about 25 years of devolution and his experience of that, but please, Anna.
Thanks, Chair, for that reminder. Alec, you spearheaded the Scottish international offices across the globe, and as we've spoken about today, recent Foreign Secretaries have outlined their concerns that the Scottish Government is stepping out of line. If foreign policy is set at Westminster, why did you think it was so important that Scotland's interests were represented at that global stage and were concerns raised by Westminster?
Well, there were some concerns raised, but of course many of the issues that these offices had as their priority, in trade and industry, international trade, impacted substantially on the Parliament's responsibilities in Scotland. They were focused on trade mainly, as well as the promotion of Scotland internationally. We take the example of China. The Premier Li Ka-shing, the deal I signed with him in Scotland was access to the Chinese market for Scots salmon, which is a huge part of the export of Scots salmon now, and also the Petrochina's investment in Grangemouth, which at that time secured the future of the plant. Incidentally, an early benefit of the relationship with Gordon Brown established was the joint initiative to save Grangemouth in 2008. So these offices impacted substantially on Scots' responsibilities. And of course, we've recognised for many years, even before devolution, that the more you signpost the Scottish aspect of investment trade, then the better it is. That Scotland has a substantial and very positive international reputation. Some of it deserved, some of it we're just lucky about, I think, but nonetheless that's the situation. So the more you maximise that, the better, and that was understood even before devolution, certainly understood, and understood by Henry McLeish, one of my predecessors, was very, very strong on this issue, and I took it further, absolutely. But I think that was to the vast benefit. I don't think there's many Scottish businesses wouldn't say it was money well spent and initiatives that they appreciated.
Thank you. And finally, it's argued that there's differing needs in Scotland and compared to England, and one of the things that comes to mind is immigration. Yet here in Westminster, we've seen xenophobic immigration policies pushed forward. Yet in Scotland we're crying out for immigration. So what dialogue, if any, did you have as First Minister with Westminster government officials in relation to policies like immigration being devolved to the Scottish Parliament?
The key discourse was on the graduate retention scheme, the ability to work for a period after graduation, which we firstly won and then got, then retained and then was challenged and eventually was lost. But that was probably there was also disputes about the treatment of asylum seekers. I remember at Dungable, which was a significant issue. But the graduate one, obviously it was not the whole ambit of immigration. We weren't going to get Westminster to concede, in my view, a separate immigration policy. Desirable though that would have been for Scotland, but nonetheless, the issue of graduates' ability to work in Scotland post-graduation was a very key one. One was recognised by the Labour administration before me, and unfortunately the Home Office started to encroach very heavily on that scheme. Now, it was a huge issue at that time, but of course with European Union migration into Scotland fulfilling many vital roles, it's an even much more pertinent issue at the present moment. And the Scottish economy has a number of great problems and issues at the present moment, but one of the greatest is the access to labour supply in certain key industries. And as MPs, each and every one of you must have constituent companies who are reminding you of that.
Thank you. Thank
you. Michael Shanks.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Salmond. Your evidence today, and when I read your evidence in 2010, it struck me that although you maybe didn't always agree with UK ministers, there was a kind of willingness to try and make it work. And you've said a number of things today about over things that mattered or cooperate when you can and various other things. So there was obviously a willingness, although you might disagree, to have always made devolution work. Do you think your successors followed the same path?
I'm not because I wasn't in the room, right? I don't know where I deliberately cited the Bernard Jenkins committee, because that's cross-party committee unanimous report. I think the institutions, once the referendum and the post-referendum period, there wasn't the same incentive that Christy and I were discussing, perhaps. These particular issues of Brexit and COVID caused great tensions. There's probably an issue as well that the generation of devolved parliamentarians, government ministers who are familiar with this place, was largely past. I think that familiarity helped, knowing how this place, not just in parliamentary terms, but in decision-making terms in Whitehall works, is a great advantage, an enormous advantage. So for all these reasons, I think clearly, but whatever the rights and wrongs, and I think the evidence points to the Brexit period in particular, and the relationships of successive prime ministers in that period as being one of great difficulty.
And I push you a bit though, because you have commented on a number of things today that you weren't in the room for. So, and you know your successors very well, although perhaps not in quite as good a relationship now. But so, do you think they have the same approach to devolution as you had about making it work, or do you think actually they're more interested in proving that it doesn't work?
No, I mean I cannot conceive that any First Minister of Scotland who was interested in Scottish independence wouldn't want to do their absolute best in running the devolved Parliament and administration, and secondly to agree as many things as possible in terms of the intra-government relations. I don't think there's any premium on not agreeing positive things, because I think success breeds success, and that was my attitude. And I've known Hamza Yousaf for many years, and he's a positive person. I'm sure that's the attitude he wants to strike up. But I do hope when David Cameron and Hamza Yousaf have their first meeting, they can sit down and talk about how they direct letters to each other. I mean, David Cameron would never, ever have written me a letter like that, or written it to some proxy. It's just the case. And now, I can't believe that Hamza Yousaf is responsible for that deterioration of relationships, since he's only been in office for a year, and David Cameron had only been in office for a week.
keen to come back on that question in a minute. I just wanted to keep you on this issue of relationships, because you specifically cited in 2010 and again today around particular big moments of national crisis, government could work very well. I think you said then that when minds were concentrated on a major issue, there was cooperation. Yeah. Obviously, the biggest major issue we've had in recent years has been the COVID situation. There was evidence given to the COVID inquiry, although not as much as there should have been, that senior advisers in the Sturgeon government saw it as an opportunity for a rammy on the Constitution. If you had been First Minister during the COVID pandemic, would you have carried out government in the way that the Sturgeon government did?
I certainly wouldn't add that person as anywhere near being a senior adviser. I mean, it struck me, the person you're talking about is Liz Lloyd. It struck me as probably the most revealing thing I saw in that was that somehow, amid all the missing WhatsApp messages, one message which managed to be somehow miraculously retained was the one that referred to Boris Johnson as a expletive deletive clown. Now, listen, your constituents, my old constituents, many people might agree with that. But I cannot believe the COVID relatives watching that inquiry wanted to hear that, or for that matter, the Scottish Secretary addressing things in the way he did in giving his evidence. I mean, the last thing COVID relatives want to hear is what politicians think about each other. What they want to hear about is what they actually did in terms of addressing the thing. So, as far as that particular case is concerned, that particular person would have been 1,000 miles from being a senior advisor.
And on that exact point about messages being retained, I appreciate you were in government in a period maybe where WhatsApp wasn't quite such a key part of our day-to-day life, but electronic messaging was in different forms. Did you retain any of your messages from that period? And are you surprised about how few have been retained by the current government?
Well, I was interested to hear that some people claimed there was practices back to 2007 to delete messages. That's the first I'd heard of it. And I actually checked with Kenny McCaskill and Alec Neil, the two ministers at the time, whether they'd ever heard of that policy, and they hadn't heard of it either. I conducted everything through my private office. Not because I wasn't, well, actually, probably because I wasn't that electronically savvy at that time. I think I first had WhatsApp in 2017 or something like that. So it was a bit after I left office. But I conducted everything through my private office, or in personal contact, phone calls or whatever. I didn't. Actually, I mean, with your indulgence, Chair, I used to get very annoyed at the informality of emails. And we had a whole succession at one point, not particularly important issues, but of FOIs which showed civil servants emailing each other about the football results. They're harmless enough stuff. So I said to John Elvidge, I said, what would be the chances of banning emails in the Scottish Government, right? And so John said that perhaps that would be a bit adventurous to ban them totally, but perhaps we could have a pilot in one of the departments. So John organised a pilot somewhere in, I think, the Historic Monuments section with 3 people in it. And we weren't being entirely serious, but I was just trying to get across the fact that I didn't think it was a great idea for civil service and official correspondence to be talking about, hopefully, Hearts beating Hibs, but if it was Hibs beating Hearts.
Right, so just one more time, if I may. Like, this is all very interesting and even amusing, but like, we're trying to stick to 25 years of devolution and Mr. Salmond's accounts thereof.
Well, and the reason I'm asking the question is because obviously part of the importance of intergovernment relations is how we communicate with each other and the methods in which that's used. And I'm asking the questions because, of course, there's been a wholesale deletion of messages. So that intergovernmental communication during the pandemic is very hard to figure out because there's huge parts of the records that don't exist. And I'm asking Mr. Salmond if he ever... Can I finish the question,
sure,
Mr. Salmond? Because the reason I'm asking you, obviously I'm not asking you to account for Nicola Sturgeon's messages, but I am asking you whether in your time in office you retained any of the messages between your ministers. Of course, Hamza Yousaf and Nicola Sturgeon were both ministers in that government. So what was the retention policy then?
Well, there was no policy for deletion, as I've already told you. And I was surprised to hear John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon say that there was, or they had been advised. And who knows, maybe a civil servant did say that to them, but not to my knowledge. There was certainly no policy in my administration for deletion of messages on the basis that we heard during the COVID inquiry. I myself did not use informal messaging at all, because I felt I had a private office and that was what I should do. I felt the best form of communication in terms of intergovernmental relations, the subject of your inquiry, was on the phone or in person, which is why I wanted to re-establish the JMC committees, because I thought you could get enormous amount more done in a room talking to people and explaining your concerns than you would in sending endless cross letters or memos to each other, even official ones. So no deletion from me, and I'm not aware of any deletion policy as was suggested back to 2007. Certainly it's not one that I practiced.
Just finally, on an issue that you've discussed in your evidence today around the letter, I wanted to come back to what you said about the letter from David Cameron to Hamza Yousaf, yes, on international meetings. And I appreciate, obviously, you now have a commercial arrangement with TRT, which might be a conflict of interest in this particular issue, given they've been called a mouthpiece of the Erdogan government. But you mentioned earlier a meeting you had with a Chinese minister, and you said you had absolutely no issue whatsoever with an official from the FCDO being present, and indeed you said you were quite happy for them to join you.
The British ambassador.
Isn't the issue with the Hamza Yousaf situation that actually he didn't tell the FCDO about the meeting and therefore no official could be present?
Well, firstly, I have nothing to declare. I mean, I have no commercial relationship with President Erdogan that I'm aware of. I produce television programmes for TRT, I present television programmes for TRT, but that is not a commercial relationship with President Erdogan as far as I'm aware. And my remarks would equally apply to the Prime Minister of Iceland, who I've met, I think, but I'm not in a commercial relationship with her either. I was trying to make a policy point. I think David Cameron was wrong. I thought the letter was extraordinarily atypical of what I remember of David's attitude to things. I nourished the hope that it was written for his predecessor and he kind of signed it and didn't really realise what he was saying. The official I was talking about was the British ambassador in China at that time, and I was trying to be helpful to him on request for getting him into the leadership compound so as he could do his job as British ambassador. And the reason I did that was A, it was a good thing, B, there was no detriment to me or Scotland in doing it, and C, I would probably, did get reciprocation from the Foreign Office at various times. But the idea that I would have asked permission to meet, let's say, the President of the European Commission or Hillary Clinton or the whole variety of other world leaders, and would only be able to meet them if I was chaperoned by an FCO official, I mean, it wouldn't even be countenanced. And why we've got to this situation that the Foreign Office is so petrified of what Hamza Yousaf might say to the Prime Minister of Iceland, I've got absolutely no idea. But as we discussed with Alan Kasser, it is a self-defeating business. It's almost as self-defeating as Tony Blair trying to ban the one-man protester in the Iraq War outside the Parliament. You can't stop Hamza Yousaf thinking as he does about Gaza, if indeed he was discussing Gaza as opposed to climate change. Plus, as I understand at that meeting, as I understand it, was at a climate change summit in Dubai. Climate change is a devolved responsibility. In fact, one of the few arguments I had with Gordon Brown was not allowing a Scottish Government minister as part of the UK delegation at the Copenhagen summit, given that we'd just passed the most adventurous, most positive climate change legislation in the world in 2009-10. So all I'm saying is, it seems to me, looking at that letter, that there must be something more to it than meets the eye, because nobody would send such a petty and ridiculous letter unless there's some backstory to it. And the idea of threatening, as that letter does, to withdraw facilities in embassies around the world, in other words, damage trade and investment in Scotland, is totally out of any proportion to whatever offence Hamza Yousaf has caused somebody by meeting the Prime Minister of Iceland.
Well, you know Lord Cameron better than me, and of course as an MP we can't question him on that matter anyway, because we're not able to question a member of the House of Lords. But just related to that, related to that, you said earlier on about these arm wrestling bouts that have come to symbolise the more recent period of devolution, and I wonder if it's related to exactly what you've just said about how relationships have broken down to the point where a letter like that is sent. So just generally looking at your relationship versus where we are now, do you think there's been failures on both sides to try and make that work?
Well, there may well have been failures on both sides. I've not been inside the room to find out. I have, and I'll refer to it again. You know, if a House of Commons committee says, as that committee did, the Bernard Jenkins committee, look, Westminster and Brexit was operating outside reasonable boundaries, and I think you should pay attention to that. I don't know what the backstory is behind the Cameron letter, but that letter was published. You know, it's like a reprimand to a naughty schoolboy. Now, I'm hoping that Hamza Yousaf can have an early meeting with David Cameron, where I'm hoping that David Cameron will be as amenable and positive as he was on non-party political matters to me 10 years ago, because I see no benefit whatsoever in trying to gag the First Minister of Scotland or trying to restrict who he meets and who he doesn't meet.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Chair. Pleasure to speak with you for the first time. I just wanted to pick up, first of all, in relation to Christine Jardin's observations that relationships are actually really important to make this work. The previous IGR system, it was previously criticised for being dominated by the UK government. If Tony Blair had continued as Prime Minister after you became First Minister, do you think you would have been able to see the improvements in intergovernmental relations that you've described that followed on?
No.
No. As simple as that. So if the Prime Minister didn't want it to work, it wouldn't have worked.
I don't think it was purely, I mean, obviously, by that stage, as Adam Castor rightly observed, I mean, the Iraq created many personal tensions. But I don't think Prime Minister Blair, at that stage in his very end of his prime, was at all interested in the internal mechanics of devolution. I mean, I think, was it written evidence that the former Prime Minister's office gave to you?
Evidence,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've looked at that and I thought, this is, I was going to say delusional. It's not anything resembling reality. I don't think the then Prime Minister had any interest whatsoever in the devolved arrangements, and I think Gordon Brown, for reasons of history, did, and David Cameron for reasons of politics, perhaps, but also because I found him a very amenable for I mean, people look at this and say, oh, why are you agreeing with that one or that one? People have political differences, different hopes for the future of Scotland. I believe in independence, they didn't. But, lots of things can be solved which are not about the future of Scotland, or about the future of a job, or the future of a factory, or the future of a fishing deal, which you should get on and do. And I don't think Tony Blair was at all interested. Perhaps he felt like some of the evidence you've received, that everything was being done, by old chums together. I mean, I saw Paul Murphy, Lord Murphy, a very amenable guy who Gordon Brown appointed to make that sort of point. My point is that clearly things weren't working in 2007. I think, certainly the plenary sessions, I mean, the Prime Minister's not prepared to go. They won't happen, and for 5 years they didn't happen. But I think the issues, once you got them going, were very interesting for the Prime Ministers for one reason or another. So the answer to the question, if Blair had stayed, I mean, that would have been the least of our worries, mind you, but if Blair had stayed, would you have done what Gordon Brown and David Cameron did? No, probably not.
I suppose ultimately what I'm come back to is the acknowledgement from your responses to Christine Jardin is actually those relationships and willingness are key regardless of what the structures were, which reflects some of the conversation we had yesterday. Yes,
although the structures are important in terms of providing the rules.
Particularly from an official perspective.
You as a member of Parliament, I mean, you want to put forward your views, you want to look for opportunities. You find your opportunities within the rules of the House of Commons, the rules of debate, the rules of questioning. And so therefore the rules and framework of the intra-governmental association. But there's also the willingness to do it, you're quite right, and the parity of esteem by which people should be held.
And that's really good that you've come on to that parity of esteem, because you mentioned it in 2010, 14 years ago, and you've mentioned it today. Now, you've talked about the parity of esteem in relation to intergovernmental relations, but I'd be really interested to know your views on parity of esteem between interparliamentary relations, because you've already talked about the fact that as time went on, people potentially in different parliaments had less experience of the other or knowledge.
Yeah, I excuse me. I didn't put this forward as a proposal at the time, but I'm sure you're going to look at that as a committee. I mean, people have talked about me as First Minister appearing before that committee, perhaps the Prime Minister or ministers appearing before the Scots Parliament. But I wonder if a model you might want to look at is the British-Irish Council, which has a parliamentary aspect to it. I mean, it's only a proposal, but it's not, it's not intra-parliamentary relations in the sense of the Prime Minister appearing before the Scottish Committee or the First Minister appearing before this or other House of Commons committees, which I had no objection to doing, obviously. But the idea of parliamentarians, in the same way as the British-Irish Council, which is an incredibly useful body, in my opinion, again, depending on... See, the British-Irish Council, the Taoiseach, in my experience, went to every single one. Every single one. The Prime Minister went to some, but not all. But for the Taoiseach, it was a huge thing, and rightly so, because you got some great stuff done. And there was a parliamentary aspect to that, which perhaps you could look at, perhaps want to look at as a model for things.
So in the absence of that proposal, as you said in 2010 in the transcript, that you were more than happy to come before this committee, and obviously you're here today as a former First Minister, but we have seen a breakdown in appearances at committees, and indeed former First Minister Sturgeon, throughout my time on this committee, did not appear, and Mr Youssef has also said that he will not appear. What's your views on that, given that obviously the committee structure in Westminster, which you know well, does have a very important role to play in terms of scrutiny of the UK government?
I mean, perhaps let's address Hamza. I mean, perhaps over a period of time he'll. I mean, I understand the argument as been stated. Look, my first duty is to be responsible to the Scots.
Mark Drakeford's felt differently in relation to Welsh affairs.
I was about to sort of agree with you, but I didn't see then, and I don't see now, any difficulty in that. I mean, look, you wouldn't expect the First Minister to appear, every 2 weeks before a Westminster committee. That'd be ridiculous. But kind of like once a year, wouldn't be. I don't see you're diminishing your key responsibility. I mean, political leaders, if a political leader goes to address the European Parliament, it doesn't diminish his accountability or his responsibility to his home Parliament. Of course it doesn't. So as long as it wasn't unreasonable demands, every time there was a crisis, the First Minister had to be summoned, But as long as it wasn't that, then I don't see any difficulty. I do think, maybe a slightly different structure of committee might be helpful in that sort of stuff. As opposed to Scottish Affairs, it might be more Intergovernmental Affairs Committee or something like that. Might help along the way.
To Constitutional Affairs Secretary of State, as suggested.
Well, as many of your party colleagues have argued over the years, and I've supported them avidly. I used to sit behind, or in front of actually, Alistair Carmichael, nodding vigorously when he made this point on many occasions, about how much money it would save and how much time it would save, and everybody would get on much better.
But it does sound to me that when this committee is looking at particular things, for example, the cost of living and the impact on rural communities, that it's not unreasonable to ask the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs to appear in front of this committee to provide those aspects.
And as long as the requests are reasonable and his or her first priority is to the Scots Parliament, I don't see any difficulty in that, nor vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, Sir Bernard Jenkin that you mentioned has said that in fact fact, the chair of this committee has engaged with Sir Bernard Jenkins in his role as liaison committee chair to look at how we can better improve those relations too. Thank you very much, Chair.
You've been engaging with Bernard Jenkins.
Indeed, and we remain hopeful we will have a serving First Minister appear in front of this committee. And it's through no lack of efforts in we're trying to secure that. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair. Just following Michael Shanks' questions about the COVID inquiry and the deletion policy or otherwise, you've been very clear in your evidence to this committee that there was no such policy in your time leading the government. Under oath, both John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon said it had been a policy since they entered government. You appointed them both to your first cabinet in 2007. Based on that point alone and your view, is it your opinion that John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon lied under oath to the COVID inquiry?
Well, that's a matter for the COVID inquiry and the Information Commissioner to investigate. Now, let me be quite clear. I am not aware of any such policy. I would have thought I would have had to sign off a policy. Looking at what John said, because I looked at this in some detail, he seemed to be referring to some advice he had from his civil servants or private office. It's possible that there was such advice through a private office. But there's certainly no general government policy, nothing I signed off, and I was totally unaware of it. And because I found it surprising, as I say, I phoned up to form, just in case you forget things. I mean, as I've already said, I didn't have an issue with this because I didn't conduct any business in that fashion as First Minister. I mean, I thought that was the whole point of having, this panoply of folk who did all your work for you. So I did everything through the private office, but I would have had to sign off if there had been a general policy. It's possible they were specifically advised by somebody or other, so they may well say that, but that's for them to clarify, and it's for the COVID inquiry to find out, perhaps the Information Commissioner.
Thank you. A lot of what we've heard today, and indeed reading your kind of preamble to this session in the Sunday papers, is blame on other people and individuals where you feel there have been failings and deficiencies in terms of how intergovernmental relations have worked. I wonder, in your reflections, have you looked at any point in your 7 years as First Minister and your other time in elected office to see areas where you could have done better to improve those intergovernmental relations? Is there anything in hindsight that you think actually your actions, the actions of your government, hampered some of those intergovernmental relations?
Well, given that they didn't, in a formal structure, exist before 2000, or had been in abeyance, let's put it that way, for years, for 5 years, and then were re-established, and then were established more when the coalition government came in 2010. I mean, that was progress. I mean, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't say that every single meeting I always said the best possible things, but we did our best to establish a structure, and we got results from it. And I think the weight of evidence that I've seen that you've received tends to support that position. There was a period where the mechanisms were in place. Did these mechanisms always work perfectly? No, they didn't. I mean, I was very disappointed by the a Scottish minister going as part of the UK delegation to the Copenhagen summit, given that we had climate change legislation. I was disappointed that there was opposition to Scotland having the executive of the British Irish Council, an issue, incidentally, which I could never understand, before and was resolved after the 2010 election. So there were some things that weren't well enough, but there was a lot of progress made, and nothing's perfect, but it was pretty positive. And of course, Alan Brown mentioned something that was crucial in terms of the finances of Scotland, which was the flexibility over the underspend and overspend, which made financial management in Scotland much better than it had previously been.
I'm just struck again in that answer. It's disappointment at other people's lack of action or work. Is there no? And I'm not just looking at processes. You were First Minister for 7 years. You held that role. You won elections. Nothing you look back on and think maybe my conduct, my time in office, decisions of my government could have made a more positive impact?
Well, if you're asking to have any regrets, and my regret is that Scotland didn't vote for independence on September the 18th, 2014. That's my key regret in politics. And perhaps,
just wondering about your regret in terms
I could have expressed the case better, and that would perhaps have come to realisation. But
nothing in your time as First Minister.
I was trying to address your point about these intergovernmental relations.
I'm saying we can be wider than that.
Well, yeah, but that's not the subject of your committee. I mean, we can have a confession.
A number of things that weren't the subject of our committee that you've been happy to answer.
My best efforts to try and keep it that way.
Well, in terms of re-establishing intergovernmental committees, I think that the mechanism of dispute resolution affecting the Treasury wasn't as effective as it could have been. I regret we didn't manage to get there. I would say, however, that probably many government departments down here through the ages have probably felt that as well through various cabinet star chambers and things. But I don't think we got as far in dispute resolution on finances as we would have liked to have done. So and I don't know if this new arrangement is going to help. But the point I made earlier about the constriction of the Scottish budget is a huge one. It really, really is. And I see no debate about this in the Scots Parliament. I see no interest in it. I know that these things are not as attractive in terms of debating politically as some other issues are, but it's a great issue at the present moment, and it's one hopefully maybe this new structure will allow the Scottish Government to pursue to better effect.
Can I move on to an issue that we've not discussed so far this morning in terms of the dual role of the Lord Advocate, looking at 25 years of devolution and the role of the Lord Advocate as both the head of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service and a member of the Scottish Government. What's your view on that?
Well, when I took office, as you may know, I withdrew the law officers from cabinet meetings. And they only came then to cabinet meetings at their request if there was an issue of law or legal advice they were to offer the cabinet on a current issue, or something happened that they had to tell us about. After I left office, that was reversed, and the Lord Advocate, for reasons I don't know, the successor Lord Advocate, not Frank Mulholland, but his successor, started going back to cabinet meetings, and I've never understood why that was the case, and I don't think it was a good thing to do. And I approve of the idea of separating the prosecutorial service from the legal advice to government service. I don't think, I think it's. I would say that now that that matter has been debated and there's been various consultations, you'd expect to see some action for that to happen. I haven't seen any coherent arguments why it shouldn't happen, apart from delay. It has many reasons for why it would be a good idea.
Just on that, if I can just ask, although they didn't sit routinely around your cabinet table, they still had that dual role. Why did you not feel then the need to take the decision, which may now come as a result of the consultations and indeed the cross-party support, to separate that role? Well,
and yes, I thought it was enough to, at that stage, to do what I did. I mean, they had to be government ministers, of course, because they had to be accountable to Parliament. And as you're well aware, you can summon a law officer to Parliament to answer questions. So it's quite proper and correct they were government ministers. I just didn't think they should be government ministers playing at day-to-day politics. They should get on with doing their job in terms of prosecutorial services of Scotland and only be called the government for legal advice. So I thought that was enough. In retrospect, because it was reversed after I left office, it wasn't enough, and I think an institutional separation would be the most desirable thing to do.
It would be an opportunity now to go back to how you ran the cabinet and not having the law officers routinely there. I don't know, I don't sit in cabinet, I don't know if they're there under the new First Minister. Would that not be enough, or do you think the perceived conflict may now be too much?
No, I think various things happened over the years which would suggest it would be a good idea to make the separation more formal. Formal in what you're separating? You're separating the role of government legal advice from the role of running the prosecution services of Scotland. So there's no suggestion or widespread belief that there's any crossover between the two, between the politics and the prosecution, which seems to be vital for the credibility of the... I mean, there's always an issue, Douglas, in politics, whether things break down or don't work properly because of the individuals involved or because of the systemic nature of things. I think in this case, over recent years, both have been wrong. But the thing you can sort, of course, is the organisation of it, and I think the separation would be a positive development.
We earlier discussed about you having previously served in both parliaments. What is your view on changes which could be made? We're now coming into the 25th year of the Scottish Parliament. It was a young Parliament when you and others were first elected in 1999. Have the structures within that Parliament worked for Scotland, for democracy, or are there things we, and I'm sure we're meeting with the Constitution Committee in Edinburgh in a few weeks' time, we should be looking at in both Parliaments to make changes to improve both how government is run but also how parliamentarians can scrutinise government?
I would have thought as you remember, Douglas, when I came into office in a minority government, and we had a plurality of one over Labour, and we had, I think, 49 MSPs, counting ourselves, and occasionally the two Green members in a parliament of 229. Therefore, the point I'm going to make, that reflected the whole system of the parliament. So the first 4 years, the committee system was balanced on that basis, and that made the committees pretty vibrant if you look back in these days. I think the committee system of the parliament is, and I don't think that's an original view, is one in particular which hasn't fulfilled the expectations that it had originally. And this is not easy because, as you're well aware, we've got 129 members. There's not a limited pool of talent, but a limited pool of people to staff to be the members on the committees to get the balances right. But I'm sure that there could be some innovation. And the one I would like to see, and there is a means, as you're well aware, in the Scots Parliament of a committee being inquisitorial, like this committee is being at the present moment, and also legislative, and some way to beef that up would be quite interesting, I think, because this Parliament benefited enormously from select committees' effective introduction through Norma St John Stevens in the Thatcher government, but the select committees came into their own, and in particular when they were released from whip appointments and it became elections of select committee members, albeit politically reserved from the whole House. I mean, that was a good innovation. And television, of course, helped enormously, has to be said, with select committees as well, made people want to be in them, So I think something in the committee system, I would say, would be the key thing. But the one thing I would say, that a few people in Scotland, whatever difficulties, problems, issues, misfortunes there are, after 25 years, I mean, people should look back and say that's a substantial distance to travel in democratic terms. I mean, very few people in Scotland would want to go back to having no parliament. And, for most people, the Scottish Parliament is regarded as the place where the key business of Scotland should be discussed. There's an argument about how much of that key business we're talking about, all of it or bits of it. But nonetheless, most people have that view. So, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. But I think the committee system would be my key target for further reform.
And obviously you mentioned how challenging it made it for the government when you had one extra seat, normally over Labour. Mm-hmm. You were then returned in 2011 with an outright majority and could have changed it, but was it the fact that it then became simpler for you and your government to have a government majority on committees, and therefore that's the reason you didn't change it? No,
I think the reason was that we had a key set of objectives to achieve in a limited time to achieve them. The committee reform, of course, is not just a matter for government initiative, as you're aware. It's a matter for the Parliament. The Parliament has to have a design, and you tend not to, in terms of top of your manifesto, say we want to reform the committee system of the Scots Parliament.
As you say, you did in 2007 with intergovernmental arrangements.
You're asking me now, and my reflection now would be, as most things do over time, the committee system of the Parliament could merit some attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to remind colleagues, we'll try and finish this session about 12:30. There's 3 members indicated that still like to ask questions, and I know Alan Brown and Christine Jarden have already asked David Ducats to come in, so if people just be generous with their time, we'll make sure everybody gets in. We'll let Mr Salmond away in good time. Now, Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. Alec, you mentioned a few times about the Scotland office. You've referred to the Lib Dem position. Indeed, Alistair Carmichael once called it the most pointless department in Whitehall. So that was before the Lib Dems went into coalition and he saw the light of a ministerial car. Obviously, that crossover year period when you were First Minister, so was there any government-to-government discussions then about the merits of the Scotland office and whether it should be abolished and what a better system could have been for that in intergovernment relations?
Well, as you probably saw, it was one of my bits of evidence to this committee 10 years ago. And of course, it was helped by the fact that Alistair Carmichael was sitting there. If I remember right, one of the committee members objected to my saying that members of the committee held this view because they only thought you, Chair, were the only person that held that view, because I'd known Alistair for a number of years on this matter. So at that time, there was 2 members of the committee held that view. I suspect there's probably more than that today. I think, for all the reasons that have been stated, it would be simpler and more effective to abolish the Scotland office and to have, if Westminster, through the Cabinet Office, where I think would be the appropriate place, which gives you, of course, access up the chain to the Prime Minister, to have a Secretary of State for the nations, or however it wants to be described. I mean, the description is not as important as the idea. And basically making sure that the administrative framework, whether it's this new framework of cooperation or whatever, is carried forward properly. Because the trouble is we're having territorial individual secretaries of state, and probably the exception has been Northern Ireland, where the job should have been and is to facilitate the resumption of the devolved authority. But now it's back. They become attempted competitors to the established processes in Scotland, and that's not. It doesn't make for good governance. It doesn't make for efficient carrying out of affairs. And negotiations that Scotland should have, and Wales should have, and Northern Ireland should have with the Treasury in terms of finance, for a committee structure to coordinate good governance, and with the leaders of the three nations plus the Prime Minister in terms of coming to key decisions, and other ministers. That would be a much more effective thing, because otherwise you get into situations of unnecessary. Now, I never found that particular problem, it should be said, and I should say that some of the Secretaries of State in my term were, Mr Moore, for example, was very amenable. But it's more the waste of it. And if, for example, the Secretary of State wants to take charge of development spending in Scotland or whatever, then that is a big intrusion into what traditionally, what should be regarded as part of the key responsibilities of the Scots Parliament. And the same would be the case in Wales. And I'm trying to remember, I think all the First Ministers I met from Wales agreed with that position.
And far from being abolished, the Scotland office actually seems more entrenched now in terms of there's 50% more staff now than there was in 2007. The staff cost budget's actually up tenfold. So is there any likelihood of it being abolished, or this kind of government change to have, like a Minister of Constitutional Affairs? And is there any reason you can imagine why there's such a disparity now in the number of staff employed with the Scotland office and staff costs?
Well, the likelihood may be less, but the incentive for doing it is surely greater, since there's much more money to be redirected to more useful purposes, I would have thought. So, I think they're wrong, incidentally. I think they would probably, from a Whitehall point of view, they probably would get better coordination through the Cabinet Office and through a Minister for the Nations. They seem to have both at the present moment. Both are Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary of State for Wales, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and they've got Michael Gove. as well, as I understand it. I mean, I don't know if I'm misreading things, but he has a ministerial responsibility for intergovernmental relations. So I'm trying to work all this out. You know, I mean, it's I'm not certain having Michael, whose talents everybody is well aware of, is probably the person who will engender the most peaceable cooperation between the various nations of these islands. Of course, the great thing about being a successful Machiavelli is nobody to realise you're a Machiavelli. I'm not sure that Michael Velli has achieved that.
Right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
David Chickett. Thank you, Chair. And thanks again, Mr. Salmond, for. I know you come from Munich today, but I was going to say for coming all the way down from the frozen north of Bamford. But so I know what that journey is like. You mentioned in your introductory remarks that I think you were referring to devolution in 3 phases. The first phase, particularly. Well, my first question was when you described the first phase as devolution had broken down, and I think you were talking about when you came into power in 2007. Was that a phenomenon that had already happened before SNP or you became First Minister in 2007?
Yeah, it's not devolution that broken down, it's intergovernmental relationships, formal relationships, the joint ministerial committee structure, the things that had been part and parcel of the Scotland Act had been envisaged as being the means of communication, formal communication. They were in abeyance for 5 years. From 2002 to 2007, I think I'm right in saying there hadn't been a single plenary meeting of the GMC, which was meant to meet at least once, perhaps twice a year, which had the First Minister, the Prime Minister on it. And so that had vanished, much to the detriment, in particular, of the devolved administrations. And all of the devolved administrations wanted it back. And when prime ministers were willing, it came back, and that was a good thing. So that had, at the very least, was in abeyance, apart from the European GMC, which was, as I mentioned, the story about Jack Straw. Jack Straw actually told me that he, as Foreign Secretary, and obviously in charge, overall charge of the European GMC, he was under the impression that the other GMCs were working. He thought, they must be working away somewhere, but in fact, they were totally in abeyance.
That had come about during a time when Labour were in coalition with Lib Dems in the Scottish Parliament or government, yes. But also Labour were in power here at Westminster, just to be clear. So, despite essentially the two governments being run by the same party, with addition of Lib Dems, that had. I mean, what's your insight on how that came about when you had two parties essentially running both?
The argument for it was, the claim was, and it's probably been made to this committee, it wasn't necessary because everybody knew each other, they could lift the phone and they were old chums and all the rest of it. I think that's how the chair described it. But I know that's not true. I mean, not that they weren't old chums, but I know it wasn't working. But I mean, Henry McLeish, I'm sure if you called Henry before this committee, he would detail the difficulties he had in a range of things. With Whitehall resistance, some of which could have been brought through the GMC structure. I started, to list a number of there were some public disputes, but there was also disputes I'd never heard of, like the security money for Glen Eagles, which wasn't a bagatelle. I mean, we're talking about a substantial number of tens of millions of pounds. Money that any fishing community would have been grateful for regeneration purposes or whatever. But this was a big thing, unstated. I mean, I'd never heard it stated before that there's this bill hanging in the ether that the Scottish Government was expected to pay. I can assure you we didn't pay it, incidentally, and eventually it disappeared. But so there was things that would have been capable of resolution that weren't resolved. And amid all whatever chumminess was going on, there were icebergs that weren't being confronted, and and the impression that I was given, and what John Elbridge certainly believed, is although day-to-day cooperation between civil servants was taking place effectively and all the rest of it, but some of these disputes were starting to crowd over into other things. They were beginning to niggle at the heart of governance.
I'll maybe come back to that concept, and I'll also come back to what you described as the second phase being much more productive between 2010 and 2014, particularly in the run-up to the independence referendum. I'll come back to that in a second. You then mentioned the third phase, which was effectively post-2014, but you described that as a total breakdown caused by, and apologies if I've misquoted you here, by Brexit and attitudes, the attitudes around Brexit. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe give us a bit more detail on how those attitudes presented themselves on both sides during that period.
Well, I mean, again, remember, I'm out of government. I'm just an observer of the political scene. I've got no more insight than that, and that's why I relied on the Bernard Jenkins committee understanding of the Brexit. Basically, what that committee was saying is there were ramifications from Brexit that the UK government didn't bother to tell the devolved administrations about. I suppose the principal piece of legislation would be the single market proposals, which clearly impinged on devolution across a range of areas. And I could understand the Scottish and Welsh governments being extremely aggrieved by that process. I think the Northern Irish government would be in abeyance at the time. But so that it seemed to be what the committee said is correct. That now there may be reasons for that, in the sense that there was great pressures at Westminster, narrow majorities, all the rest of it. There was a huge dispute about the Brexit issue, but when you're impinging on another Parliament's responsibilities, you've got kind of an obligation to make sure they know at least what you're doing, because it may be they didn't really know what they were doing.
So again, based on your not insignificant experience as a parliamentarian, but at this point you were sort of on the outside looking in and observing, did you agree with a number of SNP cabinet secretaries who, during that period, which admittedly was difficult, and I've got the scars of being in on the side of the government with a very, very small majority. Sure. So I remember that time well, but again, during that time, significant amounts of funding was given to the Scottish Government. I think it was about £180 million to help with the preparation for what was inevitably going to come when we eventually did come out of the EU. Do you agree with your former colleagues that because the SNP, and they would argue the people of Scotland, didn't vote for Brexit, that they shouldn't be actually lifting a finger to prepare for Brexit?
I don't think it's debatable about what the people of Scotland voted for. That was recorded in the referendum. But I saw this argument pursued, I think, by Michael Russell many times, because he, I think, was the Brexit minister, cabinet minister in Scotland. I think he put forward a pretty reasonable case. I mean, he was saying that, look, we're making these preparations, but we don't know what's going to happen. And that's, of course, what Jenkins' committee pointed to, where we're going to be left. But I think underlying that, if we would take away the communications, take away the confusion, take away the point of crisis, underlying it is the Brexit process has resulted, has it not, in a substantial encroachment on many of the previous competencies of the Scottish Parliament, particularly through the single market legislation. And given that one of the arguments of the Brexiteers, and I'm trying to remember, are you on which side of the...
I wasn't involved. I wasn't even an MP then.
You had no opinion. But one of the arguments from some of your predecessor Conservatives was that, that Brexit would result in more competencies, and automatically all these regional aid things would flow to the Scottish Parliament. That was one of the arguments, and...
Well, it wasn't automatic. It required statutory instruments, which, as a minister in the Scotland office, I had great pleasure in signing off to the Scottish
Parliament. But the single market legislation, as you'll understand from your ministerial experience, impinged on many of the Scottish Parliament's responsibilities.
You're talking about the UK Internal Market Act?
Yeah, the Internal Market Act. I mean, there's no question about that. Now, when, for example, the Calman Commission, if we go right back to 2001, 8-9 Calman Commission, there was lots of legislative instruments, under the procedure, LCMs, legislative consent motions, that I put through the Scots Parliament. And one of the things I've said, well, why are you doing all these? Why are you letting Westminster? Because they were additional powers coming to the Parliament And as long as the Parliament said we want the additional powers, there was no harm in having them, I didn't think, legislated at Westminster. Why not? But when the reverse is the case, when there are implications through the British market legislation that are effectively taking discretion away, then you can understand that will lead to substantial upset.
My question was specifically about the preparation for Brexit rather than the UK internal market. I appreciate that you weren't actually there at the time. I was just seeking your opinion. But in the interest of time and moving on, if you don't mind, I'll move on to my next question, which was, as I said, coming back to this period between 2010 and 2014, the Edinburgh Agreement. You mentioned earlier about how that was actually a good period for intergovernmental relations, in your opinion, because neither side of that debate was interested in being made to look like the bad guy, I guess, because there was going to be a vote on essentially which scenario did the people of Scotland prefer, the status quo within the United Kingdom, and so the United Kingdom government didn't have any interest in showing themselves in a bad light, or separation from the rest of the United Kingdom and independent Scotland, and so yourself as First Minister leading that campaign didn't have an interest in showing too much belligerence when it wasn't necessarily required, I guess. But then I don't know if it was perhaps tongue-in-cheek when you said that perhaps the fact that we're not having repeat referendums on independence, we've kind of lost that intergovernmental relation. Was that a tongue-in-cheek comment you were made, or were you actually...
No, what I was saying was in the absence of a set process. Now, it does seem to me that in the absence of saying, well, how do you get to a place where the people of Scotland make a decision on independence? Does it require, and I saw a contribution from you on this subject not that long ago in terms of the self-determination bill. So how do you get that process? Once you have the process established and everybody plays to that process, without that process, without knowing there's a point of decision, whether it be an election or a referendum, then lots of issues become proxies.
So that process, which I think it was yourself that described it as a gold standard.
Oh, no.
Was it not? Was that someone else? Was it? Sorry,
that was somebody else.
But it was described as a gold standard agreement. The Edinburgh Agreement that had been agreed.
Oh, no. Sorry, the Edinburgh Agreement. The gold standard process was according to Section 30. I didn't like that description because, the question is, how does Scotland express its sovereignty? You shouldn't elevate one particular arrangement over other ways that could equally be applied. I mean, the chairman has supported every single one of them.
Whoever said gold standard, the description was in reference to the Edinburgh Agreement, and you've already said yourself that the relationships between yourself and David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, led to an agreement that both parliaments agreed to, or had a majority to agree to activate the Section 30 and to temporarily award or give the Scottish Parliament powers to hold a referendum. So that's what happened.
Yes.
So that, I would argue, is the process.
Yes, but I don't disagree with much that you've said thus far in this question. So, but your question is...
Well, the question is...
Was I being tongue-in-cheek? No, I wasn't being entirely tongue-in-cheek. I wasn't arguing for successful referendum necessarily. I'm just saying whatever process is established, once that process is established, a lot of the arm wrestling between governments, the reason for it disappears. And that was our experience. That's why, counterintuitively, to what most people might have thought,
I'm just wondering, because my main question
between 10 and 14. But can I just point out to you that the process of ministerial proper governance was re-established in 2007 under Gordon Brown, Prime Minister, and myself as First Minister. Now, I don't disagree it was taken forward somewhat in the years 2010-14, but it was first established, re-established in 2007.
The question I wanted to ask at the end of that was, if what I understand you're advocating is to have an agreed process by which the people of Scotland could regularly come back and have the question put to them, how is that different from just running the referendum time and time again until you get the result you want?
Oh, because it's not necessarily a Section 30 referendum. I mean, if you're looking for an example of where that is in statute, then the Good Friday Agreement would give you an example of that, where the mechanism is provided for every 7 years. If it seems, in the opinion of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, that there is an appetite or wish for a unification poll, it can occur not less than 7 years after the previous one. That's in statute and legislation. Now, I'm merely saying that, in my view, I mean, it's not the only reason for peace in Northern Ireland, by no means, but providing a constitutional route for people's aspirations in Northern Ireland has been a help in the peace process. No question about that, in my opinion. I'm saying Scotland is not Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland is not Scotland, but the fact there's an example elsewhere in these islands of doing exactly that would seem to me to be a strong argument in favour of having something. Now, whatever it may be, is it, as you know, as your colleague, former Conservative leader, used to say that what you required was an absolute majority in the Scottish Parliament, and then, of course, there would have to be a referendum, and that was the generally held view. Or perhaps it was, as your very former colleague, the late Margaret Thatcher, used to say, a majority of members of Parliament from Scotland believing in independence. Whatever it may be, whatever the mechanism is agreed, once that mechanism is agreed, then other things stop being used as proxy arguments for independence.
I'm conscious that Christine wants to get in with that last question, and I had two more questions I want to ask, but I'm going to limit myself to one. In terms of the two governments working together, I'm wondering how you feel about the opportunity, given that we're no longer in the EU, and previously there was EU structural funds available for various projects around the whole UK, including Scotland, obviously, and now we have various UK Treasury-funded UK-wide funds, such as Levelling Up, Shared Prosperity. How do you feel about those funds being used in areas such as transport, for example, in which is mostly, almost entirely, devolved responsibility, but as we've seen with the Network North project, is going to be contributing to the A75 in Dumfries and Galloway. How do you see that as being an opportunity for the two governments to work constructively together in a similar way to the city region deals, for example, to push forward strategic transport projects, not just in where it connects with England, but further across Scotland?
I did once suggest that the fast rail should have started from the north to go south, and I'm pretty certain there's probably a lot of people agree with that. We've certainly got more of it built if that happens. So yes, there should be cooperation in transport, and there are many areas like the GMC discussed airport policy. Two things I would put for you, that I suspect if you analyse the structural funding, the levelling up funding in terms of the Scottish percentage and compared it to the European structural funds, and you'd find that Scotland did rather better out of the European structural funds in terms of percentage share. I'm sure research would back that up. In terms of cooperation of spending what funds there are in terms of integrated transport systems, then I think you and I both think that would be a very good idea, because it's not always as integrated as we'd like it to be.
So, very, very last question, I promise. On that, we're both very familiar with the transport infrastructure in the northeast of Scotland. Mm-hmm. The A90 in particular has done really well in recent years in the bypass around Aberdeen. But I think it was when you were standing in the campaigning for the 2007 Holyrood elections, you promised in your first 100 days that you would put legislation in place to dual the A90 north of Ellon. What happened there?
Well, I'd have to look at the particular quote, but both for the A90 north of Ellon, right? Yeah. Well, bringing about the Aberdeen bypass, I regard as a fairly substantial achievement. Given there had been 50 years previously where it hadn't been brought about. The difficulty we had with extending it, which is what I wanted to do, was there was a gentleman who worked for Robert Gordon University, you may remember, who kept making court challenges, and every time you changed the route or expanded the route, he could delay you another 2 years. This was a very frustrating experience. It affected things like the bridge just north of Inverurie, to Huntly. You'll be aware. Inverramsey, yeah. And eventually I had to do that as a separate project. It affected things like the overlay south of Aberdeen. The reason was we couldn't integrate them into the bypass project because we'd have been subject to yet another delay. So eventually I had to decide to get on with it and get it done and get it built. And
so
I'm
how
sure,
does that
I'm
tally
sure
with...
that you like me as a member of Parliament.
What we're going to do, David,
would be ambitious to see
does
it
that tally
extended.
with successive cabinet secretaries and transport ministers in the Scottish Parliament in recent years just flat out refusing to consider it?
No, I think they should certainly consider it, because I think the corner deserves
should
greater infrastructure. But you and I both benefit from the bypass, as we're well aware.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm just very conscious of time, and I know Michael Shanks wants to come in with a very quick supplementary.
Well, just a quick supplementary on the issue of the civil service that you mentioned earlier, and I'm conscious civil servants don't have the same opportunity to speak here, so maybe just focused on the political leadership. But you spoke about Sir Peter Howson and Sir John Elvidge as providing very good civil service leadership in Scotland. You yourself have, of course, outlined challenges more recently with the management of the civil service. Do you have any reflections on how that could be handled better and looking towards the future? What could be done differently with future?
Well, firstly, let's reflect on permanent secretaries. Gus O'Donnell was Cabinet Secretary in 2010. It was my choice of the success. For the first time, the First Minister chose the Permanent Secretary. He recommended Peter Howson. And I also remember what he said to me. He said, look, he's the best I've got, meaning of his permanent secretaries. I hope that's not offending him. He was around at the time, but that's what he told me. He's the best I've got. And secondly, he said, he's 60 years old. He said, moving to Scotland will be his last major job. Therefore, when he's permanent secretary, if you appoint him to permanent secretary, that's what he'll want to climax his career doing. He won't be looking for his next job, perhaps back in Whitehall. And he said something like, he said, I don't know if Peter's ever been to Scotland, but he said after a week of the job, he'll go native. Meaning in a good sense, that he would see his role and his absolute preoccupation with running the Scottish Government efficiently, properly, with a parity of esteem. He was a superb, as indeed his predecessor was, Sir John Elvidge. They were superb civil servants because they had as their total preoccupation ensuring the Scottish civil service could demonstrate it was best in class when it was compared with departments at Whitehall, but also insisted on parity of esteem in negotiation with the government. And you know, people think, why is that important? I'll tell you why it's important, because it gives every single civil servant a feeling that they're part of something really important if they're led in that direction. It's not the only thing that's necessary, but it's a big thing.
Just to bring it more up to date, though, so there was two good civil servants in your assessment and the leadership around there. What broke down since then? I mean, you've had very public issues with the civil service in Scotland, and if we can focus just on the political leadership of those civil servants, what's happened since?
Well, I mean, you know, let's not go into too many areas surrounding the lack of leadership, but I mean, I, for various reasons, obviously used to look at the Twitter feed of Miss Leslie Evans, and she used to describe her Wednesdays, Whitehall Wednesdays, as she called them, as the highlight of her week. I mean, I cannot conceive that, well, firstly, Peter Howson and Sir John Elvis were very seldom, and you know, they were busy running their departments. But I just thought that was the most curious thing for a Scottish permanent secretary. The highlight of her week should be some great achievement in Scotland. However, that's a comment. On Sir John Paul Marks, I don't know. I mean, I've corresponded with him. I haven't had the opportunity to meet him. He has, you know, great credentials in terms of his career in the civil service. The one question I would have is, I think he's about 44. You know, where is that? I mean, he may want to finish off his career in Scotland, but it's more likely perhaps he'll want to go back to the Treasury, where he came from originally. And I just wonder if, you know, when you're appointing leader of the Scottish Civil Service, by all means appoint somebody who's had experience in Whitehall departments, but absolutely make sure that their absolute preoccupation and their ultimate job is leading the Scottish Civil Service. That should be the highlight of their careers.
Exactly. I think we just need to move on. I'm very conscious of time. Christine and Jarden.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. Thank you very much for your evidence today. Mr. Salmond, you and I could argue for the next year about which policies have been right for Scotland and which policies have been wrong for Scotland, and we have done in the past.
Yes.
One of the things you've mentioned today is about the Scotland office and how you feel that that's a a waste of money. I could make the counter argument about there are lots of appointments in the Scottish Government that are a waste of money and don't actually help the Scottish people. But I think what we have in common, and what everyone in this room has in common, is that we want our governments to work for the benefit of the people of Scotland going forward. So if we take that perspective and we look at what the future might hold, and we put, I know you'll say independence, if we put that to one side, and I won't say federalism, how do we continue to make devolution work? We've had 3 iterations of the Scotland Act now. How do we continue to make it work? You've talked about improvements in the civil service, improvements in the committee structure. But when it comes right down to it, it's about the people in the room making the decision. How do we impress upon them, and how do we encourage them to work in a structure, and what that structure looks like, to work for the best outcomes for Scotland and its people?
Right, well, let's make the assumption that that's what these people, civil servants, ministers, want to do. Well, we'll start with the assumption that people are setting out with the best of intentions. Therefore, you have to have a structure which allows these intentions to be best expressed and doesn't get them embroiled in daft side-issue arguments. My reason for the Scotland Office is not just the money. It embroils people in side-issue arguments, tough wars, which are destructive of sensible policy making. So you've provided a means of structure. Now this new structure that you've been considering, the 2022 structure, apart from it being very complex,
you don't like it?
I do like the idea of the dispute resolution procedure. The secretariat it has, I can see certain advantages, but I have a natural suspicion every time the civil service come up with an idea for another secretariat, you should ask, well, who's paying for it and how big is it going to be and where's it going to start? Will it become a new department? All sorts of stuff. I'm sure you'll inquire into all that, but let's just make sure the structure allows these best of intentions to be carried forward. And I do actually think it would help in the ultimate dispute resolution if there was an agreed procedure for progress for the Scottish people. Those who aspire to independence, there should be a procedure to get there. And when we had the procedure to get there, it seemed to help in other areas as well. And then, I'm not saying we'll all go hand in hand off to Neverland together, but nonetheless it will be good for effective and competent government, which is in our joint interest.
Thank you.
And thank you for that. It's been a fascinating session as we knew. It would be just one last question. There does look like there's going to be a new government coming. With your experience in your 7 years as First Minister, what would your advice be to them about resolving, fixing, trying to come to terms with intergovernmental relations? What would you propose and suggest that they maybe think about as a priority?
Well, I don't rely on old chums. Don't rely on the informal network. I mean, the great wisdom which that your enemies sometimes sit alongside you, as opposed to opposite you, should employ. The idea that you can compensate for effective processes of government with you're hoping that somebody gets on with somebody else, I think is ludicrous. So for goodness sake, don't fall back into that trap. Try and get something which is streamlined, effective, and has that recognition of the worth and value of the person on the other side of the table or round the table. So that'd be my general advice. My advice to the Scots negotiators is make as many alliances as you can with Wales and Northern Ireland through these structures, because obviously it helps if there's three voices saying one thing. And my advice to the Labour government is try not to believe that encroaching on the territory of the devolved parliaments is a sensible way to enhance the prestige of Westminster. It might well be that prestige of Westminster would enhance if they do the opposite. I did note, and since we referred to Gordon Brown, that some of his proposals, the ones which seem to enhance the prestige of the devolved parliaments, like the Lords thing of the nations, etc., seem to be getting backpedalled, and the ones which might have diminished, like elected mayors, which should be a Scottish and Welsh competence, seem to be being shoved to the forward. So don't fall into the trap of believing Westminster will be greater if you make Scotland and Wales smaller and Northern Ireland. The reverse is the truth. And so the sensible policy of Westminster would not be trying to re-encroach in territory which has been previously conceded, but find a way to administer the islands as best you can, and, as I say, find a procedure to allow the people of Scotland their right to express their sovereign right of self-determination.
And on that note, thank you ever so much. I think we've covered a great deal of ground and territory today. I think there's a couple of things that you said you might get back to this committee about, and we'll look forward to that. And any other thoughts that you have in the course of this inquiry, we'd be more than happy to receive them. But thank you for your attendance today. Order, order.